It all starts when the royal carriages take the protagonist to his new family. Hana, his new sister, asks Boris how old he was because she was 20 and wanted to know who would be the younger sibling. The protagonist says he didn't care about that, so she could be the older sister. The girl is impressed by this reaction and quickly says it was very boring. Bored with everything that had happened, Boris says Hana could be the younger sister. The girl screams and says she didn't say she wanted to be the younger sister, but the important thing was that from that moment on, they would be a family. The protagonist still hadn't realized that he was now becoming a family with strangers, as he had another family he had spent his life with. Boris is from the Jineman family. He is the second son of Yurkin, the lord of the Travash territory. And 20 years ago, in the Jineman mansion, young Master Boris was born not long ago, and during his birth, his mother passed away. That night, his father lamented, being the only one by his side. The Jinemans were a renowned martial family, and Yurkin was certain that Boris would grow up to be a brave warrior and eventually inherit the armor and sword passed down through generations by the family, the treasures they called the Winter Resident and the Winter Guardian. The protagonist would share them with his brother Yevgen. But after the house's mistress passed away, the master began to hate all second sons in the world. But young Master Yevgen is a very kind boy, so it was certain he would fill Boris with love and affection. Even as a baby, the protagonist already fought for his survival, as the nation of Travash saw countless people lose their lives on the day of the revolution. For his uncle, who had been banished from the family, dreamed that one day he could take revenge, so the heirs could lose their lives any day because of this revolution. But even if a great conflict arose and the Jineman family lost, or if someone went after the treasure, they were not worried, since a survivor from the family would seek revenge. The Jinemans never forget love, kindness, and attacks against them. So, young Master Boris, the one who survives, hears from his father that he must survive until the end of that painful world, because the one chosen by him could not lose his life. In the Jineman house, in the Travash territory, the nurse tells the protagonist that there was a specter lurking near the Amara lake, and he should remember these words no matter what happened. He should never go near that lake, as it was visible in the night's smile, especially during storms like that, since the creature's eyes shine at night, waiting to feed on whoever approaches. Yoi insisted that the young master never go near the Amara lake. The protagonist tells all of this to his brother, who is impressed by what he hears, as Boris says that everyone kept saying that, no matter what happened, he shouldn't approach the Amara lake and should be careful with the red-eyed specter that lives there. Yevgen is even more impressed by what he hears, then wipes the tears from his face and says that he doesn't need to worry about such things, because he was just young Boris, and as the older brother, he would always be there to protect him. The protagonist realizes his smile was even more radiant, but that was strange. Even so, Boris smiled at his brother and played a lot with him, who enjoyed messing up his hair and even having wooden sword duels. Ready for the duel, Yevgen says it was time to train, as promised. Boris enjoyed it a lot and charged toward his brother, but he wasn't very skilled, and Yevgen knew that. With a simple move, he managed to dodge and assist his brother, telling him he should first make sure to be within reach. Even though he was pushed by his brother, Boris managed to land the attack, leaving Yevgen surprised, showing that his posture wasn't bad, and laughing, he admired it as a good attempt. Before Yevgen could expect it, Boris said to get ready and that he was going all out now, quickly returning to the attack. Then, he managed to land a strike on his brother and knock him to the ground. They both lay there, laughing. The protagonist asks Yevgen why he had backed off. Smiling, he replies that he couldn't help it. Inside the house, Feng was watching everything with the head of the family and says it seemed that Yevgen liked his younger brother and that it looked like Boris followed him faithfully. Yurkin, after hearing this, grumbles and says it was pathetic for a family heir and that it wasn't worth his time. Feng disagrees with this. Suddenly, the sound of clashing swords surprises the head of the family. Yevgen calls Boris to try again, and the boy gets excited with the request, but the protagonist didn't know that the strange feelings still persisted. The older brother asks Boris to try holding his sword firmly. Yevgen now realizes that it could be a decisive attack, so he blocks it, saying it was a good job, but warns that Boris was too close and then strikes him. Seeing the sword coming toward him, Boris was unresponsive. Yevgen lands the blow on Boris's head, knocking him down, leaving him almost unconscious, but the older brother holds his brother by the arms and says he made a mistake and wouldn't do it again. The protagonist didn't expect this, as it was the first time this had happened, but soon passes out. He couldn't hear a servant calling them. Desperately, the servant says it was a good thing he had found them because he wasn't supposed to return home. Yevgen became curious to know what had happened. The servant says it was Vlado. The elder had returned. Boris woke up hearing this and now knew that, unfortunately, the strange feeling he had, although something he couldn't control, sometimes appearing as a form of premonition, meant that Vlado was in front of the castle, and even with an angry dog in front of him, he said that too much time had passed, and the animal had already forgotten its former master, so he became furious with the dog, calling it an idiot. Meanwhile, inside the castle, Jurgen was thoughtful, but it didn't take long for him to make a decision. Feng asked his master if they should let the youngest one enter. The head of the family answered yes. The castle gates began to open, and Vlado started to enter. As he entered, he said it had been a long time, but now he finally thought it was time to have a serious conversation with his brother. Then, he started talking to Jurgen, who responded that it had been 5 years since he had been expelled from there, and that's why he was surprised to see him alive. Vlado asked his brother if he was disappointed to see him. The head of the family didn't know why his younger brother was there, but it could be that he had come all that way to lose his life. Vlado said that nothing had changed in that place, and the only difference was that things seemed older. Still, he asked for a drink, as he had rushed there at midday for them to have a long conversation. After being welcomed, they sat together at the table and started drinking wine. Vlado picked up his cup and began drinking, asking Jurgen if he remembered when they were young in the Longord fields, where they played together, as he still remembered their sword fights. At the time, he skipped training and played in the hills, only to be reprimanded by their father for not behaving as an older son should. Jurgen asked his brother what he wanted. Vlado said that, as always, he was impatient, but they were getting straight to business, as he wanted, and started saying that, as he knew, the elected Prince Khan, who was after him, would become the chief elector in that year's elections, and when that happened, Jurgen would be on the other elected prince's side and become a chief elector. So, the reason he had come back was to ensure the survival of their family. The head of the family tells his brother that if he continues talking nonsense, he can leave. Vlado responds to Jurgen that this castle wasn't just his, because it belonged to their parents, who had left it. The head of the family asks if he had forgotten that he threw all that away, since their sister died unjustly because of him, as it seemed he had forgotten about Yenichka. Vlado starts smiling and tells his brother to think carefully, because her loss wasn't his fault. Jurgen says that if it weren't for his brother's dirty scheme, Yenichka would still be alive, along with her fiancé. Enraged, the younger brother says that at that time, the one who went mad and killed Yeni wasn't him, but actually Jurgen. The head of the family, irritated by hearing this, grabs his cup and slams it on the table, spilling wine all over, saying that making such a ridiculous apology in front of him was pointless. Vlado says that even after all this time, Jurgen was still as horrible as ever, and that's why he thought the people of Travash were all stubborn, as this was a family that had split into many factions. Besides everything, Jurgen thought his children would be different from him and his brother. The head of the family tells his younger brother to leave. Vlado stands up and says that his brother should remember this, because it was his last chance, as they were brothers, and he was there to forget and forgive all the mistakes. Furthermore, the chief elector Khan would turn a blind eye to what he had done. With a melancholic smile, he says that all he needed to do was deliver the Winterbottom kit. Jurgen places his sword on his brother's neck and tells him to leave, shouting not to take too long. Vlado responds that even if his head were split in half, he wouldn't give anything, and now he realized his brother was even more of an idiot than he thought. Then he turns around and says it's fine, and that he would now see how long that would last, because in the end, he would take everything. After Vlado leaves the castle, Feng asks his master what they were going to do now. Looking out the window, Jurgen says they could start the preparations, because now was the time to resist. That night, Yevgen returns home with Boris and the servant. He asks where his father was, and if Butler was already in training. June responds that yes, and he had been in training for a while. Then he opens the door to a room for them to enter. After Yevgen and Boris enter, he says it's time to use the Winterbottom kit. The protagonist is surprised after hearing that. This kit is the armor stolen from the assassination of the territorial lord of another country, 99 enemies, the Snow Guard, and the sword obtained after defeating enemies for 30 years, the Invernante, the treasure of the Geneman family passed down through generations, winter gear that only the strongest warrior can possess. Over the centuries, these items became rumors, but now they were going to the hands of their masters as family equipment. Yevgen was prepared with the historical kit, leaving the protagonist impressed by seeing all of it. At the beginning of the year, in the Jinman house, Jurgen took his eldest son to a hideout and told him to follow him because he was going to show him something important. The head of the family tells Yevgen that he must have heard about that family treasure, which their great-grandfather obtained by defeating many enemies. While they descended secretly, Boris observed everything. Jurgen shows those items to his son and says that these were the Winter and Snow Guard. and that these two together were called the Winterbottom sets. Yevgen asks if this was really from the family. His father replies that if even he thought that way, the silence had been effective. He explains that their grandfather had passed part of it to Vlado, hoping they would work together, but he was mistaken, because the Winterbottom set is something that only shows its full power when used together. Jurgen makes it clear to his son that he was going to turn 20, so he needed to understand his role as the heir of the Jinman family. If danger fell upon the family, he should flee with the Winterbottom set. Yevgen was surprised to hear that he would have to escape alone, but his father said that no matter what happened, he had to survive and protect the family's inheritance, because only then would their dynasty survive. Therefore, he could not lose him, no matter what. Yevgen responds that he understood his role. Meanwhile, Boris was listening to the entire story. At that moment, the heir was ready to protect the kit and tells the protagonist that this was the sword called Winter and the armor called Snowguard, and that these were the family treasures, the Winterbottom set. Boris, seeing this up close, says it was really cool. Yevgen asks his brother which one he thought was cooler. Before responding, the protagonist now knew that this was what his father had given to his brother, so he says that since the armor was heavy when worn, the sword was cooler. Yevgen picks up the sword and hands it to Boris, saying he would give it to him once he was old enough to wield a weapon, but lets him hold it for a moment. But when Boris picks it up, he struggles to keep it upright and says the sword is very heavy. Yevgen helps Boris lift the weapon and says he can do it because now Winter was Boris's sword. Since then, the protagonist's brother always told him, whenever he had the chance, that Winter was his sword. Maybe because of his constant reminder, Boris began to think of Winter as his sword. Still, he was just a child compared to his brother, so he thought the sword should belong to Yevgen, not him. The older brother says that their uncle started a rebellion, but their father must have predicted it, and now they should proceed as planned. Yevgen tells Boris not to worry too much, but the protagonist remembers the time the butler told him about rebellions. Some time ago, Feng said that a rebellion happens within the family, where there are only winners and losers, never right or wrong. This meant that even with many losing their lives, no one was punished, and no one recognized or mourned them. And for this reason, he told young Boris that he was a member of the Travashs and should understand when the time came. The protagonist remembered how it felt like at that moment, hearing that no one would recognize or mourn what had happened. Yevgen says he would borrow the sword for a while but notices that his brother was different, thinking if anyone could survive. Before Boris could finish his thought, Yevgen tells him he doesn't need to return the sword, because that weapon was his since their father gave it to him. Boris only thought that his brother should survive and still hope to be remembered by him. Yevgen was speechless. Then, he approaches the protagonist and says that Winter was his, and he wouldn't take that weapon without his permission, and he would also return the weapon once the rebellion was over. Boris says he couldn't even hold the weapon properly. Yevgen says that even though it was a little heavy, he was just a child and shouldn't worry too much, because in the future, he would do well and also be able to wield it. Besides, he was already a warrior. Then he hugs him and says he was the warrior Boris, but they soon notice there's a loud noise from outside. They both look out the window and realize the rebellion had begun. Yevgen says that now he would have to go because this was the beginning. In the middle of the rebellion, the warriors were shouting that the head of the Jinman family would change, and yelled for the castle soldiers to drop their weapons and serve the new master. Jurgen was watching everything from the window, thinking that those who hesitated with such words had already left. Although he couldn't compare to the family's peak when his father was there, he still had the Jinman soldiers who swore loyalty. Then he goes to the terrace and shouts, saying that those who dared to invade Longord would face the light. The rebellious warriors, seeing Jurgen on the terrace, think about attacking him first, but the head of the family continues, saying that since they were hiding like cowards, he would illuminate the entire area. Feng starts using his abilities to raise a white flame. He casts a spell that passes through all the soldiers present, leaving them frightened at what they were seeing. The Jinman soldiers start shouting to attack Vlado's traitors. Meanwhile, the rebellious warriors begin running as they realize they would be fighting against a mage. Jurgen tells the rebels to move forward because his family wouldn't fall to a bunch of disorganized people. But soon, he hears the noise of a creature approaching and starts wondering what that was. Looking to the side, he faces a giant monster breaking into his castle. It was Krigal, summoned from the frozen realm. Jurgen tells his brother how he dares to use such a cheap trick, but he knew that in Travashas, there were about 3 people who could summon Krigal, and Jongnal, the archmage of the elected Chief Khan, could be there. The head of the family can't believe that Khan sent Jongnal after Vlado, and admits that his brother's position was well protected now. Several people begin to run, shouting for everyone to leave the castle, but Jurgen tells the second squad to hold their positions. Even though the tower was collapsing from the monster's attack, the head knew that evacuating the castle was the priority at that moment, as the second squad would hold off for a while, so they needed to leave as quickly as possible. Then they hear Yevgen calling Boris for them to flee. Yurkin tells his eldest son, who was with the protagonist, to go alone and leave Boris under his protection. The boy doesn't understand why his father made this decision, but the head asks how he would manage to escape with a child, as it seemed he still didn't understand what he was protecting at that exact moment. Yevgen, saddened by the situation, didn't want to leave his brother but begins fleeing to protect the family's inheritance. Yurkin and Boris follow the butler, who never separates from them. Alarmed, the protagonist recalls that his father had said it would be impossible to escape with a child, so he deduces he was just a burden to his brother. The head of the family always told Yevgen that, until the last minute, he must survive and protect the armor, and so, the protagonist knew his brother had the duty to protect the treasure, because even if he survived, he still wasn't capable of protecting the family. But Boris admits he's having that strange feeling again, and now feels that something is going to happen to Yevgen, who is trying to flee the place. The servants were terrified by the creature's attack, but the soldiers were all in position and fighting against the invaders. Feng says that it seems many people managed to escape, but the castle was destroyed. Boris turns to see all of this and can't believe his home had been destroyed. He's left stunned by the scene. Meanwhile, his father was furious, shouting that Vlado was very bold to destroy his home, and as a member of the Jinman family, he wouldn't forgive him. He asks the butler to check the status of the first and second squads. Feng begins using his magic, and even from a distance he can observe the soldiers in combat, and says that, as expected, they were at a disadvantage since they could no longer use the castle. Yurkin says he will change the strategy and attack the entrances on both sides, so he orders the soldiers to be divided into two groups to hide in the bushes and wait for the command. Boris asks his father how they were going to deal with that monster. The head tells him to stop whining, as everything is under control. That monster couldn't affect life in this world, since half of its body was in the other world. The protagonist was terrified by all of this, but in the meantime, Yurkin and the butler continue discussing the new strategy. Using his abilities, Feng gives orders to the soldiers with a whistle. After issuing the orders, they move to the side of the castle and hide with the soldiers, waiting for the right moment to act. Yurkin tells Boris to follow them slowly, but always stay behind, and when the fight begins, he should run straight to the field because he needed to escape. The protagonist asks where he should go. The head starts thinking of a place and says he should go to the Emerald Lake. Boris is surprised to hear this and, frightened, says that his nanny had told him there was an evil spirit there. But his father says he shouldn't believe a servant, and if that was the case, he shouldn't be part of the Jinman family. It was because of this foolish rumor that no one approached that place, but now it was the safest place. He warns that there are 3 trees with black trunks near the lake. Yurkin tells Boris to hide there because he will come to get him after the battle. Even though he's scared, the protagonist says he understands. The butler tells his master that it's time for them to act. He then stands up and says that everyone should attack the east entrance. The soldiers begin advancing after the order. Yurkin, seeing that his son wasn't running, asks what he's waiting for, as he should get up and run. Boris is paralyzed, too scared to move. Despite his fear, he reluctantly starts running, and thinks that his father must be right, and that the story of the lake spirit was a lie. He then accepts that he must flee to the Amara Lake. Meanwhile, the soldiers are in combat and there are many casualties. Vlado approaches the fight and says that now everyone should face him, as he would defeat them all. He goes straight to attack the soldiers and, with his great combat skills, manages to defeat 3 opponents at once. Stepping over one of the soldiers' bodies, he starts taunting his brother, asking if he was hiding after treating him like a criminal and expelling him. Now, he was hiding like a little scared rat. A warrior shouts that Yurkin is coming. Vlado hears his subordinate and starts walking in search of his brother, thinking that the day Hargrun of the Dark Blade would be replaced by the Silver Winter was coming. The rebel soldiers manage to encircle Yurkin and then charge at him. The head, seeing this, says that it was audacious for them to invade his territory and begins attacking all who approach. After knocking down the first one, he tells them to attack with everything they have because he would make them pay for their reckless bravery. But before Yurkin expects it, Vlado attacks him from behind, stabbing his sword into his back. The invader tells his brother that he's here, then pulls his sword out. The wounded head tells the Silver Winter that he's a coward, as you don't attack from behind. Vlado moves closer to deliver another attack, and tells Yurkin that he's not the same as before, that now he's grown old, and then delivers another strike, this time from the front, giving no chance for his brother, who is defenseless and now gravely injured. The butler, seeing this scene, begins running toward his master. Vlado, seeing this, says he will take his life just as he did with Junker. But before he can strike, Feng uses his magic. Everyone is confused as a fog is cast, making it impossible to see anything. The butler is using his skills to rescue his master. Vlado realizes they're going to flee, then delivers an attack, asking if they are going to run away like cowards and calling it pathetic. But Feng doesn't pay attention and continues the rescue. Before the invader can do anything, he makes them disappear. Vlado is furious for not completing his objective and orders his soldiers to search for them. Meanwhile, Boris hasn't stopped running. They're already in the forest near the lake, looking for the tree with the black trunk. After running for a while, exhausted, he finally finds it. Leaning against it, he imagines that his father will appear soon. He then sits down and says that until the rescue comes, he just needs to rest. But it didn't take long for Boris to hear a noise not far from where he was. Immediately, he got scared by what he had heard. Trembling with fear, he wondered if it could be his father arriving or perhaps a monster. The noise stopped soon after, leaving him even more terrified because nothing had appeared, until he realized that something was behind him. A giant tentacle started wrapping around Boris, lifting him into the air. The protagonist was horrified to see he was being attacked by a creature that could be the evil spirit of the lake. While Boris was trapped, he thought that the servant had been right and his father had been wrong, because there really was a monster in the lake. Seeing that he was now going to be attacked by the monster, he started screaming in desperation, not wanting to lose his life. It wasn't long before someone appeared and cut the monster's tentacle, freeing Boris and defeating the creature. Yevgen appeared out of nowhere and managed to save his brother, who fell to the ground after being freed. The protagonist was even more scared by all of this and surprised to see who had saved him. Yevgen approached Boris and, getting close, asked his brother what he was doing there. The protagonist was speechless seeing Yevgen, who hugged him after saving him and said that he could have lost his life if he had been alone. Boris said that their father had told him to wait in that place. The older brother didn't understand why their father had done that, but the protagonist asked Yevgen why he was there, as their father had said he needed to protect the Winterbottom set. The heir was speechless, and wiping Boris's face, he said he disagreed with their father, as he believed that family was more important than treasure. There would be no use for treasure if everyone were dead, and besides, they couldn't protect the treasure forever. After hearing all of this, Boris asked how he knew he was there. Yevgen said that he was his brother, so he had to protect him, no matter where he was. The protagonist was impressed by these words but was soon startled by a bright light coming from behind him. He turned around and asked what that light could be. Yevgen told Boris to listen carefully, that their uncle wasn't the only enemy, as the elected Chief Khan was working with him, and had been the one to lend the soldiers and mages. Additionally, the elected Chief Khan wanted the Snow Guard in the winter, as well as the loyalty and cooperation of the Jinman family, and for that to happen, their father needed to be eliminated. But he knew all of this when Vlado had gone to the castle, and that's why he had asked them to escape. While they were talking, a portal opened nearby, and both were shocked to see their father being carried by the butler. Yevgen asked what had happened. Feng replied that it had been Hargroon, granted by the elected Chief Khan, who possessed a potent poison resistant to cure, and even his magic was useless against it. After explaining, the butler asked why the two were together, as Yevgen should have been far from there. But before they could say anything, Feng said that everything was fine and asked if both were all right. The heir said that a strong light had just shone nearby, but it had disappeared, and it seemed to have come from the direction of the castle. Hearing this, the butler said it could be that one of Quira's eyes had been activated, as it was a spell that allowed seeing from a distance, and the great mage Jongnal could find a needle in a haystack half a day away with that spell. Since they had already seen a bright light, the location had been revealed. Yevgen, frightened, asked what they were going to do now. Feng said that they needed to hope that luck was on their side now. Yurkin, still gravely wounded, told them to go. The butler continued helping his master, who could barely speak. Seeing that he could no longer continue, he told Yevgen to go his way. He is speechless, especially seeing how Boris was. Feng asks if he understands their father's desire to protect the family and the treasures. Meanwhile, Vlado, along with his soldiers, rides toward the forest, furious. He couldn't believe the boys had escaped to the Emerald Lake, as it was the old fear of the people of Longord, and that was why it was a forbidden place, the cursed place that had taken their only sister. When they were children, Yenichka used to play with her brothers. They enjoyed themselves in the fields. Vlado admits that she had been the only person he had cared about in the Jinmen family, as he loved being with her and even watching her sleep after playing. She was the only one who saw Vlado and Junker as brothers, as she didn't like seeing them fight. But all of that ended when his older brother did something that left him outraged. Vlado couldn't understand how his older brother had sent Yeni to such a family. Junker says it had been her choice to go, and now nothing could be done except hope for her happiness. Hargrun had gone mad upon hearing this and planned to put an end to it. He went to Yenny and said that her fiancé had gone to the Emera Lake. The girl was shocked to hear this and started running desperately in search of her fiancé, knowing he couldn't go there. Vlado, seeing that reaction, thought that this was the perfect plan to stop her, because once his sister went to the lake, she would be kidnapped by his subordinate, as Hargrun didn't want Yenny to leave, but that was what he had planned. After some time, they found the young woman in a state of madness. The servants, just like Vlado, were stunned to see her in that condition and deduced that she had become like that because of the evil spirit. Hargrun couldn't understand why this had happened, as she was supposed to have been captured by his subordinate, who was waiting on the road, and she wasn't even supposed to have reached the lake. Jurgen approached and shoved Vlado aside. Despite that, he told his older brother they needed to call a doctor. But the head of the family said that Yenny no longer belonged to this world, which shocked Hargrun. Furious, Jurgen told his younger brother that he should have agreed to the girl's engagement, and that he was thinking that he had done something he shouldn't have. Desperate, Vlado said he didn't know this would happen, as he never thought that Yenny, being so fearful, would go to the lake, and he also didn't know if the evil spirits of the lake were real. Junker, hearing that, said that those excuses meant nothing, and from that moment on, banished Vlado, telling him that he was no longer part of the Jneman family. As the subordinates removed Hargrun, the head told everyone to return to the estate. But before being taken away, Vlado saw his brother draw his sword, and then said that he could fix this. However, Junker said that the insanity of an evil spirit could only be cured by taking the person's life. Then, with his sword, he walked toward his younger sister. Vlado, seeing this, cried desperately, as it was the end for Yenny. Now he wanted revenge and ordered his soldiers to search the Emera Lake for the fugitives, asking them to search everywhere. But soon the soldiers were startled by a strange noise approaching. A creature began to emerge from the lake. Several monsters crawled out of the lake. The warriors, seeing this, started to panic and run in fear, but Vlado stood his ground, yelling that they were useless and shouldn't disobey him. He charged toward the creatures that were appearing, and facing several monsters, admitted that he could smell the foul odor coming from the cursed Emera Lake, and that he would be lying if he said he wasn't afraid. But he could defeat even Junker, so he was willing to defeat everyone who came at him. He would then destroy all those evil spirits. Meanwhile, Feng tells Yevgen that he should continue fleeing, as if he understood their father's wishes to protect the family and inheritance. He shouldn't stay there because the soldiers were getting closer and would soon discover them. Yevgen says he won't run anymore and will stay to protect his father and brother. The butler says that Vlado is approaching and that they will face the worst moment possible. The heir says it's not expected for the family's inheritance to be protected, just to be used in the worst moments. Then, he looks at his father and says that if his father had what he wanted, he also wanted what he desired. After stating what he would do, Yevgen asks Boris if he understood. The protagonist, frightened by the situation, remembers when his father showed the inheritance to his older brother and hated him for what had happened, but he also didn't plan on surviving in a world without his brother or father. Yevgen turns to Boris and says that now they should think about how glorious it is for them to fight together for their own choices. The protagonist didn't know what to say in that situation until the butler says he will take the lead and that, until he is defeated, everyone should hold their ground. Yevgen says that when it's his turn to face his uncle, he won't run. Seeing all of this, the protagonist recognizes, by the unusually blue eyes of his brother, and in his unusually bright smile, that there had always been a strange omen. After they decided what they would do, they walk closer to the lake. Junker tells the butler that they finally did it, and looking at the place, he thinks that his sister must be there, somewhere in the lake, captured by an evil spirit, never even comforted. While looking at the lake, he hears someone saying that only now he was searching for Yenny. Turning around, he sees Vlado approaching with his mage, saying that after abandoning their sister without even making a gravestone, Hargrun says that now Yenny should be happy, claiming that the older brother who drove the sword into her heart had finally come to see her. Junker tells Vlado that he never recognized his own mistakes and draws his sword. Hargrun asks his brother if he's there now to apologize. The head of the family charges forward, saying that to do that, they're both too late. Obsessed with revenge, Vlado says that now they would resolve the old grudge they had until the red-eyed spirit appears. As Junker delivered his attacks, he told his younger brother that he had already saved his life, and still, he hadn't acknowledged his sins. While Feng used his magic to keep the creatures away, the head continued to tell Vlado that he had a sharp tongue for turning Yenny into a corpse. Zhongniao did the same, using his fire magic, and heard Junker tell Hargrun that he had made their sister like a twisted monster from the lake. Vlado began to attack, asking how long they would blame him for this. Despite being injured, the head managed to stop the attack. His younger brother, enraged, said that he wasn't the one who took Yenny's life, so he wasn't guilty. Junker, hearing that, said they were going to resolve this issue. Then, the red-eyed evil spirit appeared. Meanwhile, Yevgen and Boris were surrounded by creatures from the lake. The protagonist's older brother said that if the red-eyed evil spirit that took their aunt appeared, he would be able to protect himself using the Snow Guardian and the Winter Blade. Boris was surprised, thinking that the creature that had grabbed him was the evil spirit. But when he looked at his brother, he noticed he was out of his mind, his hands trembling. Seeing this, the protagonist remembered what his father had said and realized this time he was right. He had said that the Winterbottom kit is only strong if used together by one person, and that's why Yevgen had to survive and protect that relic. Holding a small sword, Boris thought that he just needed to block the first attack, and that he could do. If the evil spirit appeared, he would block it, since his brother needed to survive until the end. Suddenly, winter began to shine. Boris was terrified, watching it. Yevgen started speaking, saying that the Snow Guardian was there because the sword was glowing even brighter. Looking ahead, he saw a strong red light. Immediately, the whole environment changed, and Boris was alone, not understanding what had happened, as he didn't see his brother. He started calling out to him. Then an aura began to surround him, making strange noises. The spirit spoke to the protagonist, telling him he was a beautiful child, then showing its red eyes. Boris began screaming madly after waking up. Lying in the middle of a field, he was in a place that didn't seem like his home and was holding the sword his brother used, along with a horse. Soon, he heard Yevgen calling him. He turned around and saw him approaching. His older brother said he was surprised to see him awake, then told him to drink some water, as he had just fetched it from a lake nearby. The protagonist didn't understand what was happening. Yevgen, smiling, asked Boris what was with the expression on his face, as it seemed like he was having a nightmare or something. Boris jumped onto his brother, knocking over the water jug. He then hugged him and began to cry. Yevgen sat down, holding his brother, and said he was there to protect him. But the protagonist noticed something was strange. He then realized he was definitely at the Amara Lake, as his father was fighting against his uncle Vlado. While he was with his brother fighting the zombies, he now didn't know what had happened after that. Yevgen said it seemed like he needed to get more water, but before he returned to the lake, Boris asked where they were. His older brother said they were in the north of Longord, on the Hada Plateau, in the Guram family's territory. They had made it there by riding the horse that was nearby, but he told Boris he had been asleep. Still, the protagonist asked where their father was. Yevgen said their father had gone to another place because the situation had gotten complicated and everyone had scattered. The protagonist asked how they would find them now. The heir said that they shouldn't worry. The butler would contact them using magic soon. Boris then asked what they were going to do. Yevgen picked a branch from a plant and said that now they would see if they should find their great-aunt. The March medical faction, to which she belongs, doesn't have a bad relationship with their father. Or, they could head toward Elector Katsuya, whom their father serves. Boris was surprised to hear his brother speak like that, but soon his mood shifted, and he said that they could also go nowhere. Instead of begging for help from strangers, they could live like commoners. Yevgen replied that he had no idea what it was like to live with such a thought, as they had always lived with the help of many people, and the public sentiment toward nobles wasn't good. Boris said that their father would contact him soon. Just until then, they should relax while the protagonist finished speaking, as he heard his stomach growl with hunger. His older brother started laughing and asked if they should at least eat at a nearby village. Both went to a nearby village, where there was an inn full of people. When they entered, they politely asked to enter, and the owner of the establishment allowed them. Yevgen said they needed a room. Emmy noticed that they had good clothes, so she deduced they had money. She then said it would be 10 elso, and the heir was impressed by the price. But he took out a gold coin to pay, which surprised the woman. She said she had the feeling he was like a young rich man. She then asked how someone so young could carry such amounts of money. The men in the tavern, hearing the conversation, started to ask how people like them were there. Despite that, Emmy handed over the keys and asked what they would like to eat for dinner and breakfast. Yevgen said anything that could be eaten was welcome. The people nearby, overhearing, said they didn't think people like them ate anything ordinary. Boris was shocked to hear that, but his older brother reassured him, as everyone was laughing and commenting about it. People were making various insults, saying they were just children and didn't know anything about the world. Laughter continued all around. The tavern owner arrived with dinner and apologized for the wait. Smiling like the crowd, he asked what they thought of the food. Boris felt nauseous just looking at the bowl. It was lizard soup. The protagonist even fell from his seat, shocked by what he saw. But Jun continued telling them to eat quickly, as it was the house special. The people started saying that the young masters had probably never eaten something like that before. He then stood up and continued, saying that maybe they didn't know how to eat it, so he would teach them the proper way. He went up to Yevgen, placed his hand on his shoulder, and said it was just a matter of speaking. The heir grabbed the man's hand and asked him to teach him, wanting him to eat the food in front of him. Wei asked the people if they had heard that, as he was wanting them to taste it first. He then said he didn't want to eat someone else's food. But when he finished speaking, Yevgen grabbed the man by the neck and said that since the food was a specialty, they shouldn't be so formal about it. Everyone was shocked by that reaction, including Boris. Still holding Wei's neck, the heir told him to join them at their table. The loudmouth began screaming to be let go and for him to take his hands off him. But Yevgen did the opposite, holding the man and taking the leftover food to make him eat. Wei started panicking, as he didn't want to eat that. With no other option, he started apologizing madly. Boris started calling for his older brother, and even yelled at him to stop doing that. The heir kept holding Wei. Then, he turned to Boris and let the man go, telling him to be grateful because it wasn't merciful to feed someone insects. He then told his brother that they would eat later. The furious people rushed toward Yevgen, telling him he wasn't supposed to leave. The heir noticed all the commotion. He reacts by punching the first man who approached. On the ground, the man says he will make sure he regrets that. The heir, ready for combat, starts to wonder if he should draw the winter blade, but realizes that wouldn't really end things there. In that case, he grabs a chair and throws it at the man. This only angers the rest of the people even more. Another group then charges forward. While he holds one of them, he takes blows from a baton but manages to defend himself. However, Yevgen freezes, seeing that his brother had been captured, and Wei had a malicious look on his face. He then surrenders so that Boris can be free for a moment. Now, on his knees in front of everyone, the men tell the heir that he should have been nice from the beginning. Yevgen tells them they are cowards. Wei approaches with the bowl and says that he didn't expect to cause such a commotion at that banquet. He then calls for Boris and says it's time for them to use good manners, and he will teach them personally. One man holds the protagonist and tries to open his mouth to feed him the insect soup. Seeing this, Yevgen begins shouting for them to stop, as his brother was just a child. Wei responds that he can see they are close, so asks if he is trying to feed the child. The heir says he would accept, and tells them to bring the soup to him. The people can't believe what is about to happen, and say that this is just the pride of a rich kid. Wei stands in front of Yevgen and says that now he has no choice. He then holds the spoon, asking why he doesn't take a bite, because if he refuses, his brother will have to eat it. The heir looks at the man and then opens his mouth to eat the spoonful of insects. He bites into the spoon and completely changes his demeanor. Wei is astonished, as are the people around them, because they never imagined anyone would eat that. Boris is desperate, seeing his older brother do that, but Yevgen starts chewing the insects until he swallows. After that, he stands up, wipes his mouth and introduces himself, saying that he is the eldest son of Yurkin, the Lord of Longord. This leaves Wei even more frightened. The heir says he would officially challenge him to a duel. The people in the tavern are stunned to hear these words, as they didn't expect to get into such a big problem. Yevgen tells Wei to reveal his identity. The man, now with no other option, introduces himself. The heir says that now it's time to take his life, but he would give him a chance to surrender. During the duel, he must admit defeat, kneel with his face on the ground, and only then would he be spared. Otherwise, he swears by the name of his family that he would make him consume every last drop left in that bowl. Boris is impressed by his brother's reaction, as although he had seen him wield a sword like that before, he had never seen him in a duel. The protagonist admits that his older brother seemed like a completely different person. Wei, while drawing his sword, is unsure if the young master would spare him, but freezes when he sees the winter blade, the sword Yevgen wields. Everyone is stunned to see that weapon. Then, Wei recognizes it and says he has heard of that sword. Somewhere in the world, there might be a sword called Winter, and it could be that one. He thought that rumors could never become true, but now he knows it would be very risky to fight face to face. But he admits he must attack first to emerge victorious, so he charges forward. Yevgen blocks the strike effortlessly. Wei, after being blocked, wonders how this young man could be so strong. The heir, on the other hand, remains calm in what he's doing. He then pushes his opponent away. Wei can barely hold his ground after receiving the counterattack, but is shocked to see that the heir is approaching with a sword strike. Yevgen strikes his blow, causing his opponent's sword to break after he manages to defend himself. Wei is horrified by what has just happened. Everyone starts to wonder what that was, as Yevgen had cut the other sword as if it were nothing. Even Boris is impressed by his brother. The loudmouth, sitting on the floor, is in disbelief at what happened to his sword. Before he can do anything, Yevgen approaches and begins to speak, saying that this is a goodbye. Wei's eyes widen as he watches the scene. He starts begging for his life, lowering his head. The heir stops his weapon before striking his opponent, after hearing that. But he asks if he accepts defeat. The loudmouth says that he surely accepts, and that he is 100% admitting his defeat. Yevgen tells him to then eat the soup. The man is stunned as he looks at the bowl of soup. Boris starts calling for his brother, who tells the man that he won't repeat himself. Wei, sweating profusely, prepares a spoonful of the soup, and, with his eyes closed, starts eating the insects. After a while, having eaten it all, he starts gagging, lying on his stomach on the table. He begins to thrash about, and the empty bowl starts bouncing. Boris is stunned by how the man has reacted, but then hears his brother calling him. He walks toward the rooms, asking Boris to follow him. Upon arriving, Yevgen lights a candle. Meanwhile, sitting on the bed, Boris calls for his brother, who quickly responds. He asks if Boris is worried about something, but the protagonist has no answer. Then, his older brother notices and moves closer, wanting to know more. Boris says that he is happy to see him well, and also glad to have defeated the loudmouth. But in that moment, he thought that Yevgen seemed somehow different, and it wasn't as if he had done something wrong. He also knew that there was another choice, and if their father were present, he would praise him. Quickly, Yevgen tells Boris that he's right, because no one knows him as well as Boris does. Then, he explains that he finally understands their father's perspective, and that now he will speak for him. So he asks Boris not to let his heart soften with sympathy. He says that if he could take care of him forever, he would ensure he lived with a kind heart, but he can't stay by his side forever. Boris has his own path to follow, but to find that path, he must become stronger. However, he shouldn't become a stone. He should just turn into a clam and close up so others can't see what he keeps inside. After explaining all of this, Yevgen tells Boris that he should understand this quickly, because the world won't leave him in peace. The protagonist asks his older brother if he was the one who decided to get muscular. The heir replies that yes. Boris then says he understands, but he thinks his brother said that out of fear that he would become weak, since it's only the two of them left. Yevgen says it's already time to sleep, but asks him not to remove his armor because he doesn't know what might try to invade their room. So Yevgen will stand guard, but warns, while stroking Boris, that he will wake him in the middle of the night. It was a very clear night. Hours passed and Boris still hadn't slept. He kept watching his brother sitting beside his bed. Then he asks if it's still midnight. He then notices something strange happening. Yevgen was crying and couldn't hold it in. Boris is surprised to see this, as it's rare to see his brother cry. He starts wondering if he's dreaming, or if his brother is really crying, and with tears in his eyes, he begins to think if it's better to comfort him, but admits that his mouth won't move. He then turns to the other side of the bed and, also crying, starts thinking about what his brother had said. The next day, early in the morning, they left the town with the horse. Yevgen held the reins as they walked. Boris was already mounted on the horse and remained thoughtful, as he had never seen his brother like this before, so he wasn't sure if he should say anything. He then asked his older brother what the name of that flower was. The heir, without much enthusiasm, replied that it was called Escovinha. Boris thanked him for the help, and admitted that, in the past, his brother would have told him stories or facts about flowers, so he asked if he had forgotten the stories he used to tell. Yevgen replied that he thought he had. They had been traveling for nearly the entire day, and the sun was already setting. They stopped walking, and the heir said he didn't see any nearby towns, and it looked like they would need to camp for the night. It wasn't long before he started a fire and sat around it. Boris, still holding his small sword, remained lost in thought, but Yevgen called to him, telling him to grab his sword and also getting up, ready for a fight. Looking at the forest, he said there was a coward hiding after following them from the town, and that he wasn't alone. A man started to appear, laughing, and said that the little brat was arrogant. He then ordered the rest of the group to surround them. Boris realized that one of the bandits had freed their horse. Yevgen then told Wei that it seemed like he had many subordinates protecting him. This terrified the man, but Tao hugged the loudmouth and said they weren't together. The heir drew his sword, and Wei, seeing that, asked if that was the winter blade that the Jinman family kept. Yevgen admitted that this was expected, as there was nothing to be done since it was an honorable fight. He then remembered when he had introduced himself as the eldest son of Yurkin, and admitted that revealing his name might have been a mistake. Tao told the bandits to hurry up and take the sword. Everyone started running toward the heir, who stayed still. He waited for the right moment to use his sword to block 2 attacks at once. Even though it was a bit delayed, he told the bandits that this wasn't a sword they could dream of having, and then launched the counterattack, hitting 2 of the opponents. Ravi, seeing this, said it wasn't bad at all. He then charged in, saying that Yevgen wouldn't be able to handle the second attack. Yevgen stayed still, waiting for the right moment, but was surprised when he heard his brother calling him. Looking at him, he realized he was being tangled by chains, including his sword. Tuan, holding the chains, told the heir that he was good, even being just a boy, and smiling, continued saying that he wouldn't use his strength in that state. Yevgen raised his sword and started looking at the man, and with a slight movement of his hand, he managed to strike, cutting the chains. The group was amazed by that, as they couldn't believe that iron chains could explode. Then a man appeared, saying that it was an honor to witness something he had only heard rumors about, the legendary power that freezes anything it touches and shatters it, the famous Winter Blade. Tuan, seeing how Yevgen acted, said that it was the freezing cold of the Invernante. Just looking at it made his mouth water, and on top of that, he said the heir was quite skilled. He approached Boris and asked if he could do the same if there was a hole in his brother's torso, even though he thought it was too soon for the kid to lose his life. Yevgen didn't understand how the man had moved so quickly, so he admitted that all his movements had been exposed, but it wouldn't be hard to get through them alone. However, Boris was vulnerable. But the protagonist, holding his sword, said that 12 years wasn't that young. Tuan, smiling, told his group that the kid was talking nonsense. Boris, ready for battle, said that this meant he knew when he would be defeated, but it wouldn't be at that moment. The man then said he would see if that was true and charged at him with his axe. But the protagonist wasn't intimidated and stayed still, waiting for the right moment to act. Yevgen shouted for the man to stop, but it was too late, as Tuan had already struck, telling the protagonist that he was arrogant. The heir tried to pull his younger brother, but before he could act, an arrow struck the bandit in the neck, stopping his attack. Boris was shocked to see the man attacked. Yevgen held his brother as Tuan fell lifeless. The subordinates were confused about what had happened to their captain, until they began to be attacked by more arrows coming from various directions. The bandit group started being attacked while the heir tried to protect Boris from being hit, and as the attack continued, Yevgen admitted that it could have been much worse, but he still didn't know who was shooting the arrows. Then, another group appeared, saying that Yevgen had fought very well. The men were all hooded. Ready for a new fight? Yevgen asked who they were. Yannicka, smiling, said they were their saviors, so they could be a bit more polite. The heir said that if they expected nothing in return, he really had to thank them. The leader, sitting around the fire with her subordinates, asked if he had anything to offer after all. Yevgen started thinking about what to say, as the people who had almost taken his life were defeated in the blink of an eye by these people. He admitted that those four were very skilled, but he still didn't know if they were allies or a very strong enemy. Romavac approached and said they looked like the children of a rich family, asking the group if they had anything to offer or if they should just settle for the campfire. The heir was speechless, as they were outnumbered, but he thanked them again and said they were very skilled people. After this, the men removed their hoods and began to introduce themselves. The first was Wills, then Joachim. Romavac was next and said he was also known as the Archer. The leader, Yannicka, was last and said that people called her Yani or Nika. Yevgen was about to introduce himself, but Boris pulled his arm, signaling him to calm down. Romavac, seeing this, said that he thought they still didn't trust them, but that was understandable, and they could leave if they were uncomfortable. The brothers started looking at each other. The heir then said it wasn't that, and that they could rest there. He then sat by the fire with the group of explorers. The leader tossed an apple to Boris and told him to eat. The protagonist was surprised by everything that was happening. Yani, seeing that Boris hadn't eaten, said he wasn't a baby, but he could relax, as the fruits weren't poisoned. She asked Yevgen if the boy was his brother, as he seemed a bit too young to be wandering in desolate lands. She explained that, as they could see, they walked through those places accepting work for money, but they also went to other places in search of work. Yani also asked if they had ever heard of the land of the mortals. Yevgen asked where that was. The leader began to explain that it was where Ganapoli had existed a long time ago in the magical kingdom, so prosperous that all the pillars were wrapped in gold and jewels covered the ground. But now, nothing remained due to the war, forming a vast desert full of resentful spirits and undead. Now, the land of the mortals was a place where people enter alive and leave without life. While they were still around the campfire, Yani said that her story about the land of the mortals was surprising, and she could tell that Yevgen was imagining all kinds of horrible things by the look on his face. The heir said that, to be honest, it was just unbelievable that she made it out alive from that place, as the land of the mortals was not a place you could casually enter and leave. Romavac asked if that was serious, and motioned for the young man to look at the tip of the arrow, showing that there was something on it. The archer warned them to be careful not to touch it, as it was a deadly poison strong enough to defeat a specter. The leader tells her subordinate to stop with that, as it wouldn't prove they had gone to the real Ganapoli. She then approaches the brothers, saying that her group only roams around the place and has only brought back the things the specters were wearing. She takes out an item and asks if they want to see something interesting, starting to show a bracelet that was different from the usual ones. Johnny throws it to Boris to have a look. The protagonist, seeing the item, is impressed because there was a painting drawn on it, showing many people dancing, and it was truly brilliant and well designed. Boris admits he's never seen the Golden City, but it felt like it was right in front of him. The sand's dust glittered in the sunlight, the majestic and imposing golden pillars, and the roof of the place decorated with rubies. The protagonist acknowledges that it was indeed incredible, but feels something strange. The next day, before the sun rises, they go to a tavern. When they enter, they are greeted by Minho, who welcomes the group and says he was wondering who would be up so early in the morning. Also, Yanni looked tired. The leader explains that there were some issues and they couldn't camp outside, so they had to march through the night. Yevgen, hearing all of this, admits that he only followed the group because he didn't want to sleep near the bandits' bodies. Yanni, after taking the keys to the rooms, throws them to the air and says they must be tired from walking all night, so now they could rest. Yevgen, surprised by that, thanks her. Joachim, while climbing the stairs, tells them to get some good rest. Boris, already exhausted, tells his brother that it had been really tiring and that he was about to pass out. The heir agrees, saying that now it seemed like they could finally sleep. As they walked to their room, Yevgen wondered if there was anyone still following them. While the protagonist slept, he dreamed he was in his house's garden, playing when someone called him. Looking up, he saw a man and asked who it was. Vlado replied that he was his uncle and asked why he was playing alone, saying that this game wasn't fun and that he could show him something really fun. Boris asked what that would be. Hargrun picked him up and started lifting him. Boris thought it was fun and started laughing as he played with his uncle, who said he would never forget that game and was already wondering what kind of faces the people would make. Vlado began walking, holding Boris, heading toward a well nearby. The protagonist, frightened, started wondering what was happening and soon realized that his uncle wasn't playing anymore. He started screaming for him to let go as he was scared. But Hargrun placed Boris above the well and began laughing melancholically as if he were about to drop him. Suddenly, the protagonist woke up, lying on the ground in a panic, quickly realizing he was tied up. Yevgen, who was in front of him, was also tied up. Boris began asking his brother where they were. The heir said they needed to escape quickly because the sword was gone. The protagonist panicked upon hearing this and asked who had taken the sword. Yevgen remained silent for a moment, then started laughing and said that this was amazing and that they were incredible for being in this situation. He then told Boris that he too was just a child and didn't understand the world. However, he hoped that Boris wouldn't be like him when he reached his age, as he didn't want him to be treated like a fool. Yevgen continued, telling Boris that he should have been taught by their father, but now he would start teaching him. It was time for them to act and go after everything that was theirs. After they managed to free themselves, they started interrogating Minho, throwing him to the ground to try to get some information about what had happened. Yevgen said that he didn't have time for games, so he would ask just one more time who had imprisoned them. The heir glared at the tavern owner seriously, who began speaking, saying he never wanted to get involved in this problem, but the people hadn't warned him that children could fight. He started lamenting, as he didn't want the scoundrels to have any influence over him. Yevgen asked why he was treating that group like bandits. Minho yelled that it was Yannicka. The heir was surprised, as he hadn't expected that. He then asked if he was talking about Yanni. The man replied that her gang had sold them to the Lacourtable Mercenary Corps, and those guys paid people to use them as mercenaries until they got their money's worth, so it was likely they would show up soon to retrieve him. Yevgen kept asking, and now wanted to know where Yannicka's gang was. Minho said they were at Helmer's tavern and would be leaving again that night, the time they usually moved. The heir turned and told Boris to follow him, as they needed to hurry. After preparing his plan that night, they were outside the tavern looking for the bandit group. After finding them, Yevgen told the protagonist to hide and watch everything. Boris stood outside, observing how his brother acted. Yevgen thought that he needed to make sure to punish those who had deceived and betrayed them, and that all of this was Boris's fault. But there was a problem, as he wanted Boris's innocence to last longer. However, now there was no more time for that. He then opened the tavern door and looked directly at the table where Will and Joachim were sitting, seemingly drunk, talking only about how the Jinneman family had been destroyed. But Yevgen didn't pay attention to that, as he hadn't seen the other two members of the group. Even without knowing, he continued with his plan and, walking toward the table, grabbed a dish along the way. Getting closer, he already held a dagger in case it was needed. Near the table, He pretended to be the tavern owner and asked if they had called for him. Joachim said that no one had called for anyone, as they were no longer drinking. Yevgen said that a woman outside was looking for them. Will asked his partner if Yanni had gone to meet the merchants. Joachim replied that yes, and that they would meet them at the entrance of the village. But that was strange. The heir showed his face and asked if they recognized him. The bandits were shocked to see him, but immediately, Yevgen struck Joachim with the plate and shoved a dagger into his hand. The bandit began screaming in pain from his hand. Will was stunned and asked the heir who he was. Grabbing Joachim's sword, Yevgen answered the scoundrel, asking if he really didn't recognize him, as he was there to find his sword and wanted to know where it was. Will attacked but missed the strike. Yevgen counterattacked, asking again where his sword was. He then delivered a blow, but it was blocked by the bandit, who said it was none of his business where the weapon was. The heir then delivered another strike, hitting Will, who was startled to see the sword now at his neck. Yevgen said he was just a little thief, so it was better to speak before his head got chopped off. The man froze and said nothing more. The heir then kicked the table, startling Joachim and causing him more pain in his hand. He continued staring at the bandit to get an answer. The man with the knife, unable to bear the pain, spoke, saying that he was with Yannicka and that she and Romavak were going to sell the sword and split the money. Will told his partner that he was a traitor and that this wouldn't end like this. He then started attacking Yevgen but quickly ran away, saying that when the leader and the black gloves found out, they would tear their heads off. Joachim, now with a sword at his neck, asked to inform Yannicka that the deal was over and began speaking to Yevgen, saying he knew this would happen and that he shouldn't have fallen for this dirty scheme. He said that Yanni had gone to negotiate the sword, but it was just for show, as she would probably keep the sword herself, since Romavak's main weapon was a crossbow, so he must have insisted on selling the sword and splitting the money. And if he goes to the northern entrance of the village around midnight, he will see Yannicka's mercenary group negotiating. If they see him, they will eagerly turn him over to the mercenaries. He should also remember that Yannicka is a dangerous woman. After hearing all of this, Yevgen says that he will definitely regret it if he doesn't find the Invernante. He then yanks the dagger from Joachim's hand and tells him to leave and never cross his path again. The heir starts walking toward the village entrance with Boris. On the way, he notices his brother is unwell but says nothing to him. Yevgen then speaks, saying that it's bitter and things will only get worse from this point on. He asks Boris to look at how the dagger and his hand were, as it was something even he could do, and not just their father, as he could also take the lives of others. He then drops the dagger, making the protagonist even more frightened, as he was sure his brother wasn't that kind of person. He starts imagining that it was his fault that, in the tavern, his brother didn't chop off the bandit's head because he was hiding out of fear, and that all of this was to protect him. Yevgen says that when you have someone you want to protect, you will do anything, even take someone's life. He finishes by telling Boris that he should also value himself, because just as he would do anything for his well-being, he should be capable of doing anything for his own good, and he needed to protect and value himself more than any treasure, whether it was the Invernante or anything else, so that he wouldn't lose his life and wouldn't be abandoned, and he remembers the creatures from the lake, and also that he shouldn't get hurt, just like their father did, and not get sick, remembering the Amara Lake. Yevgen places his hand on Boris's shoulder and tells him to survive and endure the pain of this cruel world. After they left, they climbed up to a house where they could see Yannicka and Romavak. They were apparently talking, but the heir only cared about the Invernante, as he couldn't see it. He also noticed that Wills wasn't there, but he thought he would be present. Boris soon spotted more people arriving and told his brother. Seeing that group approach, Yevgen said that they must be the Lacortable mercenary troop, as he had heard they were trained warriors. Daraki, the commander of the mercenary troops, asked Yannicka what business she had to discuss. Yanni began to approach and said it was a great honor to meet Daraki of the Golden Spear in person. He said he needed to be rewarded, as the man she had sold had escaped. Yannicka responded that it was his fault for being delayed, as they had done the job as always. The commander of the mercenary troop said it would be brief. Either they would be compensated double the value, or the two would join the troop and work for them. Yanni became outraged and asked what kind of scam this was, as she was being underestimated. Romavak tried to calm her down and held his companion, saying it wasn't like that. Smiling, he added that it was natural for them to compensate for the damages, but they wouldn't be a type of help, so it was better for them to just return the money. Even though the archer tried to stay calm, Yannicka was still furious and threw the money at Daraki's feet. He said that just that wouldn't be enough, as they had to compensate for the damages, and if they didn't pay, they would lose their lives. Romavak told Yanni to hand over the money quickly. The leader wanted to try to avoid loss, but now thought she would have to pay. She then asked the commander to wait, as she wanted to ask something because she wanted to know if they had the option to work for life. The archer leaned in and whispered in her ear, asking if she was serious, as it seemed like she wanted to become a slave. The leader replied that she didn't. She quickly changed her question, asking if it would really be forever. Daraki said they would evaluate it on the first mission, as they had a contract for 50 people, but they had lost 2, so they needed them to complete the contract. Yanni said it was fine and took off her hood, showing the winter blade. Yevgen says he doesn't know what he has to do, but he needs to do it well. Now, Yevgen can see his sword and quickly starts thinking about what he's going to do. Yannicka says she can do this, but she can't change her mind afterward. The heir stands on top of the house, telling everyone to stop. He then jumps and goes straight to the ground. Daraki stands still, watching the scene. Yanni is surprised, thinking they had escaped. Now on the ground, Yevgen says to return his sword. Romavac, also surprised, asks what the young man is doing there and looks at him, realizing the heir is after revenge. Yanni tells the commander that the person they were looking for has appeared. She then asks if they can leave now. Yevgen points the sword at the bandit and asks on what grounds they were selling them, as this was a nation without slaves. The woman says that if he was caught for lacking talent, he shouldn't be so bold just because he was a novice. Complaints from a child should be made at home with the mother. Suddenly, Boris appears, saying that he was the novice because she went after them while they were sleeping, and that wasn't talent. So that's what they all took pride in. He starts remembering when they first met and how they were treated, given food and attention, showing their items. Boris says they were cowards because they took advantage of their trust, and that meant they weren't warriors, but swindlers. Both were outraged by that, and Romavac tells the protagonist that he was an arrogant child. Daraki says it seems like they have different opinions. Johnny asks why he's saying that, since the 2 hostages have appeared, so they can leave, as well as their money. The commander tells them to fight again, as he would compare the loser's side, and the winner would be allowed to leave. However, the loser would be dragged by them. Yevgen was ready for a duel against Yanni. He says to grab the sword. The woman says this was a fight she would win, but before drawing the winter blade, she thinks that if she does that, the commander will take it from her. So she grabs her sword and charges, telling him not to hate her. Yanni is quick with her movements and manages to strike, coming very close to Yevgen, who realizes he might struggle with the speed. The woman retreats and prepares to strike again. She says he talked big, but it wasn't anything special. Then she begins to unleash multiple attacks, hitting various regions of his body. The heir starts backing up as he takes the hits that were wounding him. But soon, Yevgen manages to stop the attacks with his sword. However, Boris, seeing how his brother was doing, and noticing how strong the opponent was, and that his brother was already injured, realized it was important to get the winter blade back. But at this pace, they might end up losing the fight. The protagonist notices a person on a nearby tree. Unable to recognize them, he wonders who it could be until he hears a farewell in the fight. Yanni managed to land a blow to Yevgen's chest. Seeing that, Boris begins to shout for his brother, who was still confident in the fight. He manages to pull the sword from his chest and gets closer to the woman, grabbing her shoulder and embracing her, blocking her movements. As he grabs the winter blade, as he drew the sword, his magic began to spread, and before Jannika could say anything, she was frozen, becoming a large block of ice. Everyone present was stunned, as they didn't know Yevgen could do this. He then turns and says that the fight is over and that he won. Daraki says he can go. Boris runs toward Yevgen and embraces him. Romavac, seeing that, can't believe Jannika lost. He then thinks that now that it has come to this point, he'll have to use his crossbow. He points it at Yevgen and his brother, who are still hugging. The archer is ready to fire, knowing he has no other choice. But before attacking, he's struck by 3 knives simultaneously in his arm. He starts screaming in pain after being hit, drawing the attention of the brothers, who turn around and see Romavac on the ground, injured. Daraki says, "How dare you pull those tricks in front of me?" Then he calls for Naya, who was up in the tree. The girl leaps down holding her small knives. She had large hair and listens to her master's orders to capture that loser. After jumping from the tree, she looks at the archer and starts running toward him to stop him. The man gets scared upon seeing that. He begins to dodge the girl's attacks, which are very agile, landing several strikes in different positions until she manages to make Romavac drop his weapon and surrender. Naya stares at the archer, placing the knife to his neck. Now, in a tough spot, she asks the commander if he was going to be discarded after all the deals they made and after siding with those kids. Daraki tells his subordinates to clean up the mess. Quickly, the men capture the archer, who is screaming desperately to be let go. Yevgen tells Romavac that it seemed like he didn't care about the value of a mother, so he better not find his own mother, as he was a worm. The archer couldn't believe he was hearing this. Naya kept staring at Boris, who noticed and also started looking, as he recognized that the gaze he felt from the tree must have been hers. Doraki tells the girl she did a good job and says it's time to go. As they leave, he says that they're done here. Now looking back, Yannicka and her gang never asked why they were fleeing. They must have approached with the intention of deceiving them from the start. But now all the horses were broken, and all the money was stolen. Boris was thinking about how they would eat and sleep, starting to get worried. But at least his brother was safe, and they had recovered the winter blade. The protagonist began to feel his throat tighten, then started thinking they were being followed again. He started screaming for help and calling for his brother. Boris was being choked, and it was by his own brother. But soon he managed to break free and felt like he was falling. Then he woke up startled in the middle of the forest, lying under a tree. With his hand on his neck, he admitted it had only been a dream. He then saw his brother lying nearby and was surprised to see him like that. He had never seen him on the ground like that. Desperate, he started asking if everything was okay. Yevgen didn't respond. The protagonist, getting closer, realized his brother was just sleeping because he was tired. He then started covering him up and wished him good night after lying down beside him. But suddenly, the air started sweating cold and woke up terrified in the middle of the night, then began writhing uncontrollably. The next day, they returned to the city and went to the exchange point, where they met the owner. Yevgen, along with Boris, said he wanted to sell a few things. Then he placed an item on the table and asked how much the man thought he could get for it. The man began to evaluate it and said it wasn't bad at all, well preserved. However, it was old, but he found 2 letters engraved on the item. He then said it would be worth 300 elso. Yevgen started looking at the item and said it was too little. Boris began paying attention to the negotiation. Hyun rebutted, saying that it was already old, and if Yevgen wanted more for it, he was trying to rob him. He said if he didn't like the price, he could go somewhere else because he was sure he wouldn't get more than 200 elso, as maybe a lady used that kind of outdated thing. Boris told his brother that the mirror was precious to him, so it was better not to sell it. Yevgen said no, and accepted the 300 elso. The protagonist was speechless after that happened. But soon after they left, they went somewhere else to eat. Yevgen asked Boris if he was hungry, as now he could eat to his heart's content, since the food looked delicious. The protagonist holds a piece of bread and starts wondering how he could eat it, because that amount of money was crazy. His brother would never sell that mirror, not even for 3,000 elso, let alone eat a meal paid for with items from their mother. Boris admits that he didn't mind eating dry bread and water, but now he wanted to know how long Yevgen would keep treating him like this. He then asks when their father would contact them. The young man says it seemed like it would take some time, but he was sure that their father was recovering because he thought he wanted to see them when he was well and healthy. That's why they should eat this food to ensure they stay healthy too, so they would be ready to see their father at any time. After saying this, he goes back to eating, and Boris wonders if that could be true. Even with doubts, he says his brother was right, but he didn't understand why Yevgen didn't want to see their father. If that's not it, what was the reason for Yevgen having such a sad expression? After they ate, they went to sleep, and Boris began to dream again that he was being strangled. He starts to wonder why he had that dream again, as he could see his brother strangling him. Still in the dream, he manages to open his eyes and realizes that his brother was actually on top of him, strangling him. This terrified him because he hadn't imagined it. Boris saw that Yevgen had a different look in his eyes and seemed like another person. The air held his brother by the neck as he lifted him up. The protagonist started screaming in fear and struggling to break free until his brother threw him against the wall, causing a hard impact. Boris asked why his brother was doing this because he didn't recognize him anymore. The protagonist realized that Yevgen was staring at the winter blade. Then he started screaming for him not to do this and ran to hug him, asking if he was really going to take his life. Crying, he also asked why he was doing this and started begging him to wake up. But suddenly, Boris woke up startled from the bed, and Yevgen asked what had happened, seeing his reaction, as it seemed like he had a nightmare or something. Boris noticed differences in the person he was seeing compared to the one in his dream and was shocked by it. Then, he started complaining of pain and put his hand on his back. Yevgen asked his brother where he was feeling pain. The protagonist remembered being grabbed by his brother and thrown far away, hitting his back against the wall. Then he remembered it and said he had just fallen out of bed while sleeping. Yevgen, smiling, said that this usually didn't happen, but he must have been really tired. However, since they had rested enough, they would travel more that day. Boris couldn't stop thinking about what he would do. It wasn't long before they started walking in search of new places. As they walked, Boris couldn't stop looking at his brother, as he couldn't stop thinking about what had happened that night. It wasn't even an illusion. His brother had really attacked him, but he thought that Yevgen hadn't been in his right mind when he tried to attack him. because his hands were warm and sweaty when he strangled him, as if he had a fever. Also, it seemed like he didn't remember what had happened the night before, so Boris was wondering what his brother was hiding. Boris approached Yevgen and asked if he was okay. The young man, acting strangely, said yes and kept walking, leaving the protagonist behind. Boris admitted that now he was sure his brother was very sick, as they had been walking non-stop and couldn't get any help. And now he started doubting whether they were going to Aunt Janine's property, and also didn't know if his brother would make it there, feeling like they had nowhere to trust. The protagonist stopped walking and asked if their father wouldn't appear. Yevgen turned and said it wasn't for that reason. But Boris asked him to be honest and just tell him what had happened, as he was starting to think their father had been captured. The older brother tells Boris to wait, then sits down and places his hand on his head, as he wasn't feeling well. The protagonist realizes something is wrong, as he vividly remembers the summoned monster that tried to devour the castle that day, as well as the lake monster. It didn't make sense for his memories after that to be so vague, as he didn't know what had happened that day. Running, he asks what he had seen at Lake Amera and what had happened to their father. Yevgen, seeing his brother like that, says he's right, and with his head lowered, he says their father wouldn't appear. Boris was shocked hearing that. The heir says their father went to a place from which he cannot return, as he was gravely injured after the battle with Uncle Vlado and is now with the butler, so he would be fine even without them. Hargrun looked at his nephews, thinking about what to do. Boris was paralyzed, watching all of that, until Yevgen shouted to be careful because the spirit of Lake Amera was emerging. The creature was giant, full of bones, and was about to catch the protagonist. He was stunned, seeing that creature with red eyes. He didn't move, and his eyes were glazed, watching the spirit use its magic on the boy, who dropped his sword and fell to the ground as the monster got closer. Boris closed his eyes, bracing for the worst. Yevgen extended his arm and managed to pull his brother, throwing him backward to protect him. Then, facing the monster, he told Boris to run. Still on the ground, Boris saw a strong light after Yevgen attacked the spirit, and he became even more terrified by what had happened. Boris, seeing that creature, quickly remembers the maid speaking about the lake monster. The spirit began to respond, saying it was the monster and that it didn't resemble anything alive or dead. Its eyes seemed like balls of fire that only watched the world. The monster struck Yevgen with its enormous wings, and Boris ran away like a coward, not even looking back for a second. The protagonist didn't know what had happened to his brother after that, as while he ran away like a coward, Yevgen stayed behind to fight the monster. That night, they made a campfire in the middle of the forest, and the sword's guardian was sad after everything that had happened, just like Boris. Yevgen says that when they wake up the next day, the protagonist should go alone, as he thought it would be better for them to separate, since there wasn't much time left. Boris was stunned to hear that his brother didn't have much time left and even started to freeze up, not knowing how to respond. He then simply says he didn't want that, and would stay by his side until the end. Yevgen asks if he has another crisis. He might end up taking his own brother's life, as the spirit of Lake Amera was what took Janine's life. He remembered her as a kind and charitable person. But when she returned from Lake Amera, there wasn't a trace of the person she once was, and that he could remember. Her voice had also changed into a scream, like a monster. The madness of the spirit can only be freed when the person loses their life. After telling the story, Yevgen stands up, says that this will also be his future, and shows the sword to Boris, telling him it's time for him to hold it. The protagonist is surprised but doesn't miss the opportunity and starts trying. Even using all his strength, he could barely lift the Winterblade. Yevgen begins to help, and says that the weapon was still too heavy. Positioning his brother properly, he says that when he's older, he will be able to handle it, and it would be great if he could endure until then. Boris looks with teary eyes, but his brother says that this is the age when he'll be able to survive on his own. The protagonist starts walking, and his brother calls out, saying he couldn't grow up so fast. On the other hand, Yevgen's time was passing faster by the second and would soon hurt him. Boris, holding the Winterblade, looks at his brother in fear, but deduces that he would leave him at that moment. The protagonist didn't want his brother to leave and leave him alone, so he throws the sword and says he doesn't care if he loses his life, because he knows Yevgen probably thinks he wouldn't be able to survive on his own, and people from all over the world would be after the Winterblade, and they were probably stronger and crazier than those they had faced. That's why he wanted to stay by his brother's side, even risking his life for him. Yevgen gets angry and slaps Boris in the face, leaving him with teary eyes but saying nothing. The sword's guardian asks the protagonist if he has forgotten what they talked about, then asks him to repeat it. Boris begins to cry, and trembling, says he told him to live. Yevgen tells his brother to never again say he would prefer to lose his life, as when his time comes, he must become strong. He then hugs him and says that no one will protect him, and he will no longer have the luxury of resting under any tree's shade. He must never trust anyone, or let his guard down in front of anyone, but even though it's difficult, it will be worth doing all of that, because he will survive, and he will be able to survive long enough to experience all the infinite possibilities that will be present in his life. Yevgen picks up the winter blade from the ground and says that now he wants Boris to keep the sword, as if he loses control again, he can use it to end his madness. Yevgen admits that his memory was starting to fragment, and he wondered what he would do if he no longer knew who he was, if he could go mad and thrash around like a monster, just like Aunt Janine, and even hurt Boris. The heir admits he thought it was morning, but when he realized it, it was already late as he lit a campfire. The dawn sky had already risen without him noticing. Looking at the moon, Yevgen says he's becoming something he doesn't recognize, something that makes him feel fear, and he also feared doing something to his brother and seeing his lifeless body when he opened his eyes. One afternoon, Boris had gone to gather wood for the fire and noticed his brother was very weak, sitting by a tree. He then asks why he didn't sleep a little since he hadn't slept in 3 days. Yevgen is surprised to have passed all these days and, seeing Boris arranging the fire, stands up holding an item and tells the protagonist that he should keep the snow guard as he no longer needed it. Boris says that item belonged to him. The heir says there was no use for armor from a man who was already lifeless. He then hands over the armor completely and tells his brother he should promise one thing: never seek revenge. For a long time, many nobles of Travash were torn apart in faction wars. If only one side had chosen to forget their grudges, or had chosen to forgive the other side first, that tragedy would not have happened. Through the dispute between Uncle Vlado and their father, the one who took their father's life was the red-eyed monster. He then prayed that he would get involved in fights because of the family, as he would grow and continue to experience and see new things. Boris feels sad hearing this, but Yevgen continues, saying that when that happens, he wants him to forget what was happening at that moment and just forgive everyone who needs it. He keeps insisting that they should let all of that go. Night had already fallen, and they were camping in the middle of the forest. Boris was asleep while Yevgen stayed awake by the campfire. He was running low on energy but still recognized he couldn't sleep, or he might turn into a monster. The heir began to dream of a beautiful place where he was lying in the grass with his brother, and their parents were watching them from a distance. Boris asked Yevgen if he was okay, and that he could just sleep and rest peacefully. The sword's guardian, though already exhausted, managed to open his eyes and saw his brother taking care of him and going back to sleep after covering him. Yevgen woke up and started looking at the sky and was amazed by what he saw as he was witnessing something that rarely happened. A meteor shower made the sky shine in a different way. He even stood up to admire it and recognized that now he knew what he could do for them. After a long and stressful day, it was time to rest, and the shooting stars left a trail behind them as they went with their mother to rest. Boris got up, remembering what he had told his brother, not to worry, as he would protect him, and no one would wake him. He quickly got up and started looking for his brother, but he realized there was a hole where he had been lying. He was scared, and walking closer, remembered when he used to be afraid of the dark, and that it wasn't something to worry about, because tomorrow would soon come, and so he should forget the difficult world, and not cry. When he reached the hole, he could see what had happened. He saw his brother gravely injured, and continued remembering his words, saying he would give him a goodnight kiss always, and would always be by his side. Seeing how Yevgen was, he remembered his last words, to remember that when he had a good night's sleep, the night would pass in an instant. That night, the heir, while digging, kept looking at the stars, and was amazed because he saw them in a different way. After the hole made with his own hands was ready, he looked at Boris, who was asleep. Even with the winter blade inside the hole, he began walking to where his brother was sleeping. He throws more wood on the fire and looks back at the protagonist, who is sleeping peacefully. He then approaches and begins covering him. Boris starts to open his eyes, but, seeing that it's his brother and that he's returning, continues to sleep. The winter blade was buried with its blade facing up, and Yevgen approaches the hole and looks at the sword. Standing there for a while in that situation, he slowly begins to fall, closing his eyes completely as he falls until he drives his chest onto the sword. At dawn, the birds began to fly, and Boris finally woke up and saw the situation his brother was in. There was a severe wound in Yevgen's stomach, where he had his hand. The protagonist notices the wound and then kneels, thinking that his brother had probably dug that hole with his own hands. After throwing himself onto the winter blade, he used all his strength to pull it from his body. Boris couldn't understand why Yevgen had done that, and didn't even let him do anything for him. The protagonist starts arranging his brother in the hole and remembers the phrase he always said about not even living his own life. The boy starts burying his brother, and after a whole day of effort, finishes burying him and tells him to sleep well. Now, Boris was alone. He picks up the winter blade from the ground and begins to walk. The next day, in the village, Hana was upset, saying she didn't like the clothes she was wearing. Her friend Rico, a subordinate, says they were in the countryside and the clothes she wore were usually custom-made. The angry girl says she couldn't wear those made clothes. Rico, startled, says that no matter where she went, she would get the same answer. And now she was in the middle of the street with her suitcase. What she was feeling didn't seem like her suitcase had fallen into a puddle of mud, but her lady always took her anger out on her. They weren't in Anamar, but in Travesh, so she didn't know where to find a dress. Walking through the town, she admits that no matter where she looked, it seemed like there were no tailors, so she thinks of visiting a seamstress. The people in the town saw Boris approaching, holding a sword. They couldn't believe they were seeing a child his age traveling alone, especially with a weapon like that, as it seemed like a good sword and had a strong shine. Rico also noticed that the protagonist was new to the town and deduced that he was her age, and couldn't believe he was walking around carrying such an eye-catching sword. Moreover, he seemed a little tired, and she thought about asking where he was headed. She was impressed to see the boy standing in front of a tavern. Rico didn't like these places, so she tells Boris to wait for a moment. She approaches and tells him he shouldn't go into that place recklessly, as he had no idea of the things that could happen inside. Boris, seriously, says he's fine. The girl is surprised and wonders why the expression on the protagonist's face was so heavy. Seeing him enter the tavern, she thinks he has a layer of darkness over his face. Boris, after entering the place, goes straight to the counter and politely asks for a room. He is greeted by a woman who is very cheerful. The protagonist says he would like a room. Tanya asks if he was alone. Boris responds that he is, and the woman says that a common room costs 5 silver coins. She points out that there was a room nearby with a small bed, but it wouldn't be an issue in his case. Boris starts looking around the place, but before going, he says that he had another request. If there was any place willing to hide a child like him, as he didn't need money, only food, and a roof over his head. The protagonist couldn't stop thinking about his brother, telling him to live and endure the cold of that winter. The woman looks at Boris with pity. Although it seemed like he was traveling alone, he appeared to have had a good life, so she was curious to know what had happened. Tanya says she couldn't offer much at the moment, but she thought the mercenaries were looking for a messenger boy, and there could also be a wealthy person looking for jobs. A man calls the girl and asks for another beer. He was Punin, the blacksmith. Tanya tells the man she would bring it and informs Boris who the person is, explaining that he often said he needed an assistant, so it could be a good opportunity. But first, she wanted to know his name, so she introduces herself as the innkeeper's daughter. Boris, even without knowing if he could trust her, introduces himself as well. Then he approaches Punin, who, seeing him, says he was a thin and weak boy and doubts he could work as a blacksmith. The protagonist admits that he honestly wasn't sure what needed to be done. The blacksmith responds that at least he wasn't talking to a liar, as he imagined that Boris didn't come from a commoner's home, so he wanted to know which family he was from and if he had experienced any recent conflicts. Boris starts thinking about his answer. Punin wants to know the answer because he had sold some weapons to noble families recently, and conflicts often arise between noble families, usually over goods. So, if the boy had experienced one of those conflicts, he might understand the expression. The blacksmith, seeing that Boris was taking a long time to answer, asks if he doesn't want to speak. He then bangs the glass on the table, saying that it no longer mattered and that he could come to his forge the next day, as he would give him work, and if it became too much, he could leave. Tanya approaches and asks Boris if they had finished talking and that it was better to thank him quickly. Boris is speechless, but ends up doing what the woman asked. That afternoon, the protagonist is sitting at a table when the woman arrives with food, asking if he had dinner because it was a special soup and it was better to eat it before it cooled. Boris doesn't change his expression. Tanya asks if he knew that he needed to change his habit of not thanking when he felt grateful. Immediately, the protagonist changes and starts saying thank you. The woman leaves the room and leaves him alone. It didn't take long for Boris to finish the soup. Afterward, he lies down on the bed with the sword. He starts wondering what kinds of tools and weapons the blacksmith made, as he was sure it would be tiring. But now, he wasn't really concerned about that because the problem was trusting all those people. Even people he had considered close had betrayed him and his brother when they faced crises. Even those who saved them, before approaching, had stolen the sword and sold them to mercenaries. So, those people in the tavern might be planning something similar. For Boris, the friendlier someone was, the more rotten the betrayal could be. So he thought it was better to check the forge, if it really existed, and if the blacksmith was a trustworthy person. Two men were riding horses through the city and shouting for everyone to get out of the way, but Boris stayed in the middle of the street. One man managed to stop the horse near the protagonist and told him to get out of the way if he didn't want to lose his life. Boris was startled but realized the horse was going to hit him. The animal struck with its hooves, but Boris managed to defend himself, though he was thrown to the ground after being hit. Chiho asks if he was trying to hurt himself by staying in the middle of the street like that. He says if Boris stays in their way, he better kneel down and should have been doing that already. The man says Boris is rude because he doesn't respond. The boy starts to get up and apologizes for being in their way, even though they were wrong to ride so fast in a place with so many people. Chiho says the protagonist is good with words, and his partner also says the boy needs a lesson. The man takes a whip and says that's exactly what he wanted to do. He then starts hitting Boris with the item. Chiho strikes Boris in the face with the whip, and the boy on the ground tries to defend himself from the blows he's receiving. After some time of hitting, the man asks if Boris has understood now. Boris, scared and unsure of what to do, starts to imagine if he were big enough to draw that sword, or if Yevgen was there. Soon, he changes his thoughts. Realizing they were useless, Boris gets up and tells Chiho to start begging if he understood. The men are left speechless after hearing that. The protagonist recognizes that he must stand up on his own, as he is now alone in this world. Moreover, Yevgen had sacrificed himself so that he could live, so he wouldn't be defeated by these people. Meanwhile, at another inn, Hana asks Riko if she hadn't found the dress, saying it was ridiculous not to have a tailor in that place. The girl was the princess of Belnor. Her subordinate apologizes, saying she couldn't find a place that sold a custom-made dress. She also admits she hadn't even seen a tailor's shop, and all she had seen was a little boy with some social problems. Hana's father starts knocking on the door of the room, asking if he could come in. The girl excitedly says yes. Count Ganymede of Belnor enters the room, saying he had brought a new dress. Hana grabs the clothes and tells her father he is the best. Ganymede tells his daughter to get dressed so they can go for a ride through the city at night. He continues, saying that learning and observing the traditions of other countries is a good way to help with her growth. After the girl gets ready, they leave together on horseback. As they set out for a ride, Hana asks the count where he got the dress, since Riko hadn't been able to find even a store. Ganymede says he bought the dress from someone who makes them by order. The girl asks if noble women in this country didn't wear dresses. The count says there are no nobles in Travashes. Soon, Ganymede hands his daughter over to his subordinate and tells him to take care of her for a moment. The girl doesn't understand this and is even more surprised when her father leaves without saying anything more. The count starts shouting for them to stop. He is facing a group of delinquents who were beating up Boris, who was already on the ground. The boy is almost out of strength, holding onto the sword. The people, seeing that the count was there, say that now someone capable of stopping all of this has arrived. Tanya pulls the blacksmith out of the tavern and shows him what is happening. Ganymede tells the group of young people what all this commotion is about. Chiho responds that foreigners should just follow their path and stay quiet. The count, seeing Boris's condition, says they were only bothering a defenseless child and should leave him alone, but the men say they won't do that. Ganymede starts to draw his sword and tells them not to forget that what brought them here was themselves. Arjun tells the count that he's too old to play the hero. He then charges, riding his horse. Ganymede stands still and strikes the young man at the right moment, sending his weapon flying and burying it into the ground. The count points his sword at the man and asks if he wants to continue. Arjun, trembling with fear, turns around and starts to flee with his group, telling Boris he's very lucky. Ganymede tells his subordinates to ask where there is a doctor. Tanya approaches and says there is a pharmacist 3 houses down. Suddenly, Hana starts shouting for her father, who goes to her to get her. When he picks her up, he asks if he had made her worry, saying he had promised no one else would suffer injustice. He hugs Boris and tells him he should keep this in mind too. Hana looks at the protagonist with pity. The next day, early in the morning, the protagonist wakes up lying on a bed and wonders where he is and if the wallpaper flowers belong to his mother. He then starts looking for the sword and quickly gets up after not finding it. A nurse who was by his side says that the sword was under the bed. Boris asks where it is, and the woman tells him to stay still as she checks his injuries, then asks where his home is. The protagonist says he has no home, and the nurse comments that he doesn't look like a traveler. Boris says that even if he had a home, he couldn't return, so it wouldn't make a difference. The woman, smiling, asks if the boy was a fugitive or had some tragedy in his past, as that's usually the story of children who leave home. She admits that the count who saved him was kind, but he shouldn't trouble him and should just return home. Boris didn't expect to be saved by a count. The maid says he was Count Belnor of Anomerad, who saved him from the attacks. Riko enters the room with new clothes and is happy to see that the protagonist has woken up. She approaches and starts looking into Boris's eyes, beginning to say that he must see that he had been mistreated by entering that kind of inn, so he should be grateful that his lord passed by. As Boris took the clothes, he wondered who this girl was, who then asked how he was feeling and if he could move. The Count wanted to see him for dinner that evening. Boris sat at the table with Ganymede, who greeted him and said he was happy he had gotten up. Boris, seeing how the Count was, couldn't believe he was the person who had saved him. The next day, the protagonist was eating with the Belnor family. The butler asks for permission and serves Boris's plate. The Count tells the boy that once he tries it, he'll understand the true taste of his country. Hana says that the dish served was a truffle omelet, famous in their territories. Ganymede tells Boris to eat quickly, as he must be hungry. Boris, in front of all that food, admits that it had been a long time since he had eaten such a complete meal, but he starts eating slowly, savoring the meal. After they finish, the protagonist says he really liked the food. The Count says he's happy to hear that, and that now he will formally introduce himself. He then says his name, and that he's from the city of Belcruz, and Hana is his only daughter and heir. Boris realizes that now that they've formally introduced themselves, he'll need to say who he is. He then says his name, and that he's from the Jinneman family. But since Ganymede isn't from that country, the protagonist thinks he won't recognize his family. However, the Count begins to recognize the name and asks if he's talking about the Jinnema family from Longord, as he's heard they're famous for their warriors in Travachas. He then asks if they've faced any trouble. Boris says that his father passed away and his uncle is now in charge of the family. Ganymede asks, in that case, where he plans to go, as it would be hard to return home. The protagonist says he has no destination in mind, but that a certain blacksmith intends to hire him. The Count says he understands, but asks if Boris has had any interest or knows how to do that kind of work. Boris answers that he's not sure and will have to work hard to enjoy that kind of job. The man, while filling his cup, says he has a proposal and asks what Boris thinks about going to a nomarad with them. The protagonist changes his expression upon hearing the proposal. Hana looks shocked, as she didn't know why they were bringing the boy to their home. The Count replies that it will be Boris who answers this. He made the suggestion. The protagonist wants to know why this offer. Ganymede slams his cup on the table and says he can give any reason, but he recommends not listening to his daughter. Boris simply says he wants to know the reason and thinks that if there is one, he would like to hear the details. The man begins to speak, saying the reason is that he wants to make good use of him. The protagonist realizes there's a reason, as the Count is being kind. Ganymede continues, saying that he is a man who has everything he could want, has a lovely daughter, so he doesn't need another child, but reluctantly, he needs a child of his age. A while ago, before Hana was born, he made a bet with a friend that when they had children and their children reached 10 years old, they would fight each other with swords. The person who lost would grant a wish to the winner, anything they wanted. As time passed and Hana was born, he forgot about the bet. Then last year, he suddenly heard news about his friend, whom he hadn't seen in a long time, that they had 2 children. But unfortunately, the oldest was a complete fool. After discovering that the Count had a daughter, his friend put his younger son through intense fencing training. If his son won, he could ask for his daughter to marry his oldest son. Hana drops her plate on the floor, saying, "This is ridiculous," and asks her father if he is serious, that she would marry a fool. The Count tells his daughter to calm down, swearing by his honor that he wouldn't let that happen. Boris tells Ganymede that, as he wasn't his son, he had no right to fight his friend's son. The Count says he would just say he adopted him, raised him in a separate area, and brought him back for the duel. Everyone would believe it, and if he wins, he would reward him and let him live freely. But even if he loses, he won't punish him. Just ask him to leave his territory. Boris asks why him, of all the villages he had passed, as he was just someone who received help by coincidence and didn't know anything about him. The Count answers that Boris was in a situation where he had nowhere else to go, even though he was the son of a lord, so he could easily get dozens of normal boys. But he wanted one with education because once they reach a nomarad, Boris would have to act as his adopted son immediately, and there would be no time for teaching. Plus, the Janema family is one of the most famous swordsmanship families, so Boris would definitely have that inherent talent. Now he wanted to know if Boris would accept the proposal. The protagonist starts to think and considers the option of going with the blacksmith. There, he would live a peaceful, quiet life, and it wouldn't be bad to live while hiding his identity. Compared to that, a nomarad was a distant land, so if he went there, he would have to face new challenges and obstacles. But he would also be able to leave Travachas, the land that took the lives of his father and brother, where he had lost so much just by being born there. Boris decides to leave, so he goes with the Count. On his first trip, he travels by carriage with Hana. As they depart, he thinks his hometown is contaminated, and now, what he wanted to remember were the words of his brother, telling him to survive. Now, The protagonist was heading to new lands. In the carriage, he was with Hana and Riko. The princess notices that Boris didn't talk much. So, she asks her friend who is older. The girl says she wasn't sure. Hana asks the protagonist if he had said he was 12, because that's also her age. So who among them is younger? The princess thinks that if they talk about this, they might be able to converse a little before they reach her home. Boris says it doesn't matter to him, and that she could be the older sister if she wanted. The princess is surprised, not expecting such a simple response. Then she asks when his birthday is, and says hers is April 8th. Boris says his is July 12th. The girl says he's boring. The protagonist, feeling bored, says he will be the oldest then. Hana gets irritated and yells, as that's not how she wanted things to happen, saying she never said she wanted to be the youngest. And what does it matter since when they became a family? When they arrive at the castle, the princess gets out and runs straight to her mother, who's waiting for them. Izavo of Belnor tells Hana she had told her not to run while wearing a dress. The girl replies that she knows and apologizes. Boris was enchanted by the place and couldn't believe how bright it was, realizing that he had really come to a distant place. He also realized that probably no one would recognize him. The madam, looking at the protagonist, asked the count if this was the child he had mentioned. He replied that it was, and it had been a long journey, so it was better for them to go inside and finish the presentation within the castle. The butler was unloading the luggage from the carriage while Boris, holding the sword, didn't know where to go. After brief greetings, they entered the castle, and the Belnor family sat down with Boris while they had tea. Izaro mentioned that she had received a letter earlier, so she had a basic understanding of the situation, and that the protagonist could feel comfortable while he was there. Hana told her mother that she had always wanted an older brother, so she decided to be the youngest. The count laughed and asked the protagonist if they were close now, and that while he was there, he could call him father and his wife mother, as he should keep that in mind. He added that Boris was the youngest son of the Elgudin family, the fallen lord of Gvansk in southern Travaches, and he became their adopted son at the age of 5 because their families were friends. So the protagonist should say that he only received financial support from them, but grew up with his father after his mother passed away. After that, his father also passed away suddenly, so he came to live at Belnor Castle. The count asked the protagonist if he understood everything he had to say, and mentioned that there were people in the castle who knew little about the situation, such as the knight Hugh, Willa, the nurse who had cared for him, the maid and Hana's friend Riko, and the people who were with him when he helped Garivo Delamere and Gromios. But even they didn't know the full situation. Only he, his wife, and his daughter knew the whole truth. So Boris should respond to people according to what he had just said. He asked if Boris understood, and the protagonist said yes, acknowledging that this was all a fabricated story but with some similarities to his own situation. The count instructed them to prepare Boris's room and also thought it would be good for him not to stay far from Hana's room. He told his wife that the room they had would be perfect. Izaro asked if he was referring to the room on the second floor of the Moonlight Tower. She understood, and would do as ordered. Hana was confused about why Boris would use that room. The count continued, saying that he would find a fencing instructor for Boris, but in the meantime, the protagonist could rest from the exhausting journey. He told Hana that he would like her to show Boris around the castle since it was large and easy to get lost. The girl said to her father that Boris also needed a servant. Garamind laughed and asked his daughter if she was already worried about her older brother. He planned to introduce the boy to the servants the next day and would also let him choose a servant. The protagonist was surprised, not expecting to be treated as a son. Also, seeing that smile, he couldn't remember when his father had smiled like that. After the conversation, the protagonist went to the guest room. He sat on the floor, holding the invernal, and thought that now he was finally alone. He began to remember Hana saying she would show him his room the next morning, but the protagonist admitted that this was a really nice guest room, and probably even better than his own room in Travaches. He started to imagine that this family treated their guests with great importance, as from the room, you could see the path the carriages traveled. He was also impressed by the size of the forest they had passed through. Boris said that the place even seemed like what he dreamed of when playing with Yevgen. But remembering his dream even more, Boris admits that this was not the place, as Travaches is a land where only needlegrass grows, and compared to that, Anomarad is full of flowers, and the people are warm and friendly. But Boris knows that this is not his home, and from this moment on, he is in unfamiliar territory. The next morning, Hana asks Boris if he slept well because her father had asked her to show him the castle. She was going to take him to the room where he would stay, saying it was an incredible place, and she was sure it would surprise him. The girl tells the protagonist that if he doesn't get distracted and follows her closely, he won't get lost. Boris doesn't answer and just follows Hana, who continues walking and tells him that there are 4 towers at the 4 corners of Belnor Castle. The room is in the lunar tower. After a while, they arrive at the room. Boris is amazed by what he sees, as the place he would stay in is unimaginable. While observing, he says nothing until Rico appears, calling for Hana and apologizing, saying she was so busy she didn't realize she had disappeared. The princess tells her maid that she was showing Boris the castle and that she wanted them to follow from a distance. Rico says it's fine and breathes a sigh of relief that she hadn't done anything wrong. Seeing this scene, the protagonist remembers that he also had servants in Travaches, but they were like family and had no fear. Hana continues showing the room to Boris after the maid leaves. She shows him another room inside the room, the wardrobe with clothes already hanging, and says they will also teach him how to dress for various occasions. The girl tells him that, after her parents' room, this was the best room in the castle, and that they said they would give it to him when he turned 15. So, it would be best for Boris to keep it clean while using it. He doesn't understand why he is receiving such special treatment, as he would leave soon after. But at that moment, they were siblings with a good relationship. However, it was likely that in the coming years they would become strangers. They go to the room's balcony, and Hana says that it had an excellent view and that, besides that, the sunset was beautiful. Afterward, they went to the kitchen, and the princess, introducing the staff, says the food smells delicious. Then they went to the dining room, but since the place was very large, they usually ate in a smaller, cozier room. After walking through nearly all the parts of the castle, Hana begins to wonder if she had really shown everything. Then she remembers that there was still the study room, and since the master was visiting other regions, they could make a visit. Soon they arrive at the study room, which is really empty. The girl says that there is a wealth of books in there. Boris knew exactly what kind of place a study room was, as he couldn't enter such a place in his house because his father was always in there. But now he began to find it strange to miss a father who was so cold and strict, and he admits that this happens because he could no longer see him. Boris notices something is wrong with Hana. She begins to call Lanzier and asks why he was reading her father's book without permission. The boy quickly closes the book. The princess says she couldn't believe he snuck in there just to read the books. Lanzier, that boy, was the servant of Count Belnor. Hana was displeased to see the servant there. She then strikes the book and says how dare he do that, as he should recognize his place and shouldn't be there. The girl puts her finger to Lanzier's forehead and says she will tell her father everything that happened and make sure he is expelled. Boris, witnessing this, doesn't understand why that servant entered the study room in the master's absence. The boy begins to apologize to the princess and lowers his head, saying he made a mistake. The protagonist realizes that Lanzier has a different aura from the other servants, as he remains calm even after being caught. Hana says she will let it pass because Boris is there, but if she catches him there again, she will tell her father. The servant bows his head and says he understands. After that, Ranzier starts walking and passes by the protagonist, who notices that the boy didn't seem to be from a nomarad, just like him. A little later, the count was introducing Boris to the castle staff. He mentioned the protagonist's name, explaining that he had adopted him 7 years ago and that he would now live in the castle, so he wanted the best service, just like Hana. The servants bowed and responded that they understood. Garamid told Boris that he also needed a servant. He began showing the ones working in the castle and asked Boris to choose one. The protagonist started looking at Lanzier, who also kept his eyes on him. Boris wasn't sure what would happen or what mistakes he would make, since someone almost his age might mean that he would overlook certain situations. Also, someone less educated would be easier to deceive than someone intelligent, but he started wondering who that servant was that he had just met in the study room, because his aura felt different compared to the others. Boris told the count that he wanted someone close to his age. The man thought for a moment and said that the child's name was Ranzier, then asked if Boris wanted to have him as a servant. Boris said yes. Garamid called the boy, who walked ahead of Boris and bowed, saying his name. The count told Ranzier to address the protagonist as young master and to provide the best service for him, and now the young servant could abandon his other obligations to become Boris's servant. The boy said he understood the orders. Boris, observing how Ranzier acted, admitted that at first glance he seemed subservient, but he didn't feel any respect in his voice. And now, he understood why Hana had acted the way she did when she saw him with the book. The servant called Boris to go to his room because there were some things he needed to inform him. They quickly went to the protagonist's room. Once there, Ranzier asked his master to sit down. Boris said he was thirsty. The boy respectfully got a glass of water and served it to him, then stood in front of the protagonist, waiting for him to finish before taking further orders. But Boris, after finishing, asked what he wanted to discuss. Ranzier said that first, he would tell him about the count's family, which patrols the county once every 10 days, travels to foreign lands once every 2 months, and sometimes their trips can last 5 days or even a month. The place he visits most often is Celtica, and he also visits the nearby territories to trade spices. Boris was surprised to learn that the Count isn't frequently at the castle. The servant continued, saying that while the master is generous to those around him, he is not the type of person to forgive easily after boundaries are crossed. The protagonist, listening, acknowledged that the Count takes good care of his people and territory, but acts with a firm hand. Ranzier said that the lady is almost always home and loves waking up in the morning and lying down early in the evening, and that she is the type of person who would get easily offended by the slightest mistake, so it's better to be careful not to upset her. Boris had realized that Izaro wasn't an easy person to deal with. The servant then finished talking about Hana, but mentioned that Boris probably already knew the type of person she was. The protagonist noticed that the boy was being cautious with his words, probably because he couldn't afford to be reckless in what he said about her, especially after what had happened. Ranzier mentioned that the lady's birthday was next month, and there would be many visitors from various places, including from the capital. Relatives from the Marquis Crezane family, to which she belongs, and the madams who serve this family would be the most important guests. The party would last 2 days, and there would be a gala ball in the evening. Then he asked Boris if he was a good dancer. The protagonist started remembering the rebellion after hearing about the gala ball, as families facing hardships only think about eliminating each other, making it impossible for anyone to learn to dance amidst all that. The servant said it seemed like something Boris wasn't familiar with, but he could teach him. Boris began looking at Ranzier, as if he had a lot to learn, and asked the servant what his tasks had been so far in the castle. The boy said he had been serving Count Belnor but had only arrived there a year ago. The protagonist asked where he was from. The servant replied that he lived in Celtica. Boris knew that was the capital of Anomarad, but it was quite far away, so he wondered if the boy might have been sold. He then asked if his parents were alive. Ranzier became sad and said he had no idea, that they were alive when he left, but he wasn't sure how they were now. Boris admitted that it hadn't been right to ask such a question. The boy said he had a younger sister and that his master had been kind to them, and his sister also lived in the castle. The next day, while the protagonist was reading, the servant said he would like to see his sister. Boris said he would like to go with him. The boy didn't respond immediately, then asked if he was a knight. The protagonist was surprised, not expecting that kind of question. Ranzier said he would trust him as a knight, and then they went to where his sister, Lanzheim, was. The girl was alone, and didn't look at her brother or the protagonist when they entered. Boris noticed this and became curious, as she seemed like a fragile child, resembling a tulip bud, with a malnourished appearance, her face pale and expressionless, almost like a wax figure with no soul. The servant told his master to sit in a chair at first. While Boris waited sitting, Ranzier approached his sister and asked if the view outside didn't look prettier because of the weather, mentioning that a bluebird had flown by and was beautiful. Its blue wings shimmered under the sunlight, and he truly wished he could have shown her because it had been early in the morning. From afar, the protagonist observed the siblings talking, and admitted that he never imagined his servant had this side to him, as he didn't think the boy would share all the good things that happened that day, talking about all the good things in the world and everything beautiful that happened. And even though he seemed cold and indifferent, there were still things he found beautiful. Therefore, he recognized that they were all in the same space, but felt that they were somewhat distant, like in a world of their own. Ranzier told his sister that it seemed like she wasn't in a good mood, and that it wasn't good to stay under the sun too long, so he asked if she thought about taking a nap, because she would meet Milo and Azucena in her dreams. Boris started to wonder about what they were talking about. The servant continued asking the girl if she wanted to take an afternoon nap. The protagonist thought that this could be a sibling secret. Ranzier picked up his sister in his arms and took her to the bed, telling her to sleep and have sweet dreams. After doing this, he admired his sister for a moment before turning to his master, changing his expression, and saying that now they could go. Inside the castle, Hana was talking to Boris and said that she hated Lanzheim. The protagonist asked why, and the princess replied that the girl acted like an idiot, and that's why she hated people like her, because she knew how to talk but said nothing. And when she saw her eyes lost and unfocused, she just wanted to pinch her. Boris was surprised by this information and said that the girl didn't seem well. Hana said that maybe she was being super lazy, because the only thing really stopping her from doing anything was her leg. But she didn't even leave her room, didn't read, didn't do embroidery, and didn't learn anything. Rico, awkwardly, said it was time for a snack. The princess changed completely and said they needed to go quickly because the snack was cream cake. But before leaving, she told Boris that those siblings should be more grateful and independent, and that Lanzheim made Ranzier treat her like a goose that lays golden eggs. She also says that she was forgetting something, that their father had found someone to teach him fencing and had heard that he would already be there the next day. Boris asks if this is true, and Hana says that the instructor is very skilled but has quite an eccentric personality. Then, she starts wondering if she should also meet him and learn fencing, as she might be talented. The protagonist, seeing her reaction, begins to wonder if his new sister could do something like that. That afternoon, the protagonist starts walking through the forest and begins to think that after being inside for a few days, he felt his body had become stiff, and it would surely be difficult to keep up with the fencing lesson. He stops walking after finding a walnut tree, as he notices that the walnuts seemed ripe, so he thinks about climbing the tree to pick them, but looks around first, unsure if climbing trees would break some rule. In the past, Yevgen would let him climb on his shoulders, making it easier. But before climbing, several walnuts start to fall, startling him. Quickly, Boris realizes that something was up in the tree, but it moves so fast that it could have been a mountain beast, or perhaps the evil spirit of the Lake Mara, or something similar. But the walnuts kept falling, and a smiling man appeared, asking the protagonist if he liked walnuts. The stranger, Amit, kept staring at Boris, who, looking up, couldn't believe it was a human. So, embarrassed, he started laughing, having already thought it was some kind of monster. Amit kept knocking down more walnuts and told the protagonist to gather them all, then climbed down from the tree, saying that many had already fallen. Boris began to wonder who this person was, who had no decorum, and was asking him to work. The swordsman said it would take all day to collect them alone, so he was seeking help. Amit asked the protagonist what he was looking at, and if there was something on his face, suggesting it would be better if they gathered the walnuts from the ground. Boris, not saying anything, started helping the man, who told him to be careful while picking the ones still in their shells. The protagonist remembered that Yevgen had said something similar before, but still couldn't believe he was being asked to collect walnuts like this, just out of nowhere, and that the man was strange. After some time, they managed to gather a sack of walnuts, and Amit said that most of the walnuts from that tree were in the sack. Then, it was time to leave. Boris asked the man where he was going. Amit said he was going to the castle. The protagonist asked why he was going to the castle. The swordsman wanted to know the reason for the question. The protagonist simply asked if he knew whose castle it was. Amit said that the place belonged to the second most powerful family, but he thought no one would call them that. But now, he had forgotten the name of the castle. Boris, seeing the man's reaction, admitted that he was awkward and strange. But seeing that he had a longsword and was heading to Belnor Castle, it was likely that he was the fencing instructor who had arrived, perhaps not yet recognized. Any other member of the family would treat him formally, but if he really was the instructor, getting closer might be useful. Boris asked if walnuts were gifts. Amit said yes, because one can't visit a house empty-handed. The protagonist asked if the owners of the property would like it. The man responded that if someone openly despises a gift, they don't deserve to be the owner of the house. Hearing this, Boris then asked if they could bring anything as a gift. Amit began explaining that it wasn't polite for a guest to do that, and that since ancient times, gifts were a form of goodwill. After some time walking, they reached the castle. Upon arrival, Boris asked to inform his father that they had a guest. The soldier bowed to the protagonist, following his orders. The boy thinks the swordsman would be surprised when he found out who he was, but Amit asks Boris what he was looking at. Now he imagines that the man had known all along. A butler approaches and tells the protagonist that he has been called to take the guest to the reception hall, where Master Ganymede is waiting along with Hana. After they go to the room, the count tells Amit that he is welcome. The swordsman thanks for the invitation and shows the sack of walnuts, saying that it's not much, but it's a gift. Then he starts throwing the walnuts on the table, impressing Hana. Amit watches their reactions and says that the fruit was known as the fruit of secrets, which makes you age a year for each one you eat. And if the princess eats them, she would age 20 years just by eating 8 of those walnuts. Boris, seeing this, wonders why the sly look, as he didn't imagine the man would trick his sister, saying it was the fruit of secrets when he had just picked it from the forest. But soon the protagonist realizes that Amit knew Hana's age, so he asks how he did that. The swordsman says there's a way to know just by looking, and that he is also 12 years old. Boris replies yes, and begins to imagine that the man must have heard this from the count. The princess asks if she would age by eating those. The protagonist tells her not to touch the fruits with her hands, as she could get hurt. The count calls Amit instructor and says that these are his children, Boris and Hana. The swordsman says that Amit isn't his real name, and it's just a fake name he used before. Ganymede then asks what his real name is. The instructor apologizes and says that he doesn't reveal his name to anyone, because if he moves, he will have to change his fake name. So it's better to call him Instructor Nuts. The count agrees and thanks him for the invitation, as he is counting on him to guide his children. Amit is surprised and asks if the princess will also be participating in the lessons. Ganymede says yes, and that it could be seen as a joint practice. Then he asks if they can start the lessons. The instructor says that's fine and that there's no rush. They can start the next day, as they've just met. He also warns that he won't address the children formally during the lessons. The Count says that he can do as he sees fit. The swordsman stands up and thanks, saying he will leave, and tells Boris to accompany him, as he wants to talk to him while taking him to his room. After they are in the room, Ranzier appears saying that the dish was a gift from the kitchen. Amit comments that it's easy to eat the walnuts after peeling them and tells the servant that he's looking more like a master now and asks if he wants to learn fencing. The boy replies that he wasn't given any orders. The swordsman says he's being generous and starts telling Boris that the room has an interesting name, the Lunar Tower. The protagonist asks how he knew this name. Amit says that he's an instructor and knows everything. The protagonist admits that until now, all his instructor had done was tell him to tie his hair and ask the servant if he wanted to learn fencing. But soon, Amit calls Boris and starts thinking that the name wasn't strange. Then he asks if he's from Travashes. The protagonist is startled, and Amit continues asking where he's from. Boris replies yes and admits that he's surprised, but it was part of the past that the Count had done. The instructor laughs and says that he knew that Boris wasn't blood-related to the princess. The protagonist agrees. The swordsman says that then Hana is the real daughter of the Count and asks if he wants to know how he knew all of this. Boris begins to think that the man is playing games with him. Ranzier tells Amit that this is because Boris is the same age as the princess. The instructor responds saying that Boris is as clever as he appears, then asks how he figured out they were the same age. The boy says he didn't know. The swordsman says that he has superpowers that allow him to know the age of anyone. After hearing that, Boris is sure that the Count must have said something, so he asks if Amit knew Ranzier's age. Amit looks at the boy and says that the servant is 12 years old and older by a few months than Boris, who asks the boy what month he was born in. Ranzier replies that he was born in February. The protagonist is impressed, seeing that the instructor got it right, so he asks if he also knew that Hana was older by a few months. Boris thinks he will trick the man now, as he had heard the princess call him older brother. Amit tells the protagonist that it was a good try, and that Hana was born 3 months before him. The protagonist knew his sister was born in April, so indeed, she was 3 months older. The swordsman begins to talk to Boris, who can't stop wondering what else there could be. The man tells the protagonist that he has talent and could become an incredible swordsman if he trained well. Boris asks if he could say that just by looking at him. The instructor asks what he's trying to say, as he had said that because of how he lied. Boris wants to know what lying and fencing have in common. Amit says that all renowned swordsmen don't just know how to swing their swords, as some know how to use axes, and being good with weapons isn't everything. No matter how talented you are, you will fail if you don't have quick instincts and the ability to think on your feet, because you must know where to step to corner your opponent. And those who are clever know how to adapt, so he asks Boris if he knows how they think one step ahead. Before hearing the answer, the instructor points at the protagonist and says they lie like he did. Taking the princess as an example earlier, she wanted to become an adult so quickly that her lie worked instantly. Boris is surprised to know that Hana wanted to become an adult so soon. Meanwhile, Ranzier just listens to the conversation. The swordsman begins to yawn and says he's getting tired after so much talking, and since this is his room, he'll take a nap. He then stands up and leaves Boris with his servant. The protagonist is left confused by that. Meanwhile, in the ruined castle of the Jinneman family, there were parts still being used. Vlado was overseeing the place, looking out the window and saying that summer had ended. As he observed, he lit a few candles. The butler approaches the room where he is. The heir asks his subordinate if they had any results, and Feng responds calling him master. Vlado finds it strange since the butler was calling him master as if it were something trivial, but now he could be his best partner, as he had betrayed his own master, Junker. The Hargrun begins issuing new orders to the butler, which he calmly follows. Feng also says he believes Boris has gone toward Anomarad, but although they are unsure of his exact whereabouts, they confirm the fact that a young boy carrying a sword in white clothes was seen with the noble from Anomarad. Vlado says that the boy could be with the Infernal. The butler says that the noble was using a fake name this time, so they didn't know who he was, but he would start an investigation to discover his real name. The Hargrun says to track Boris and the Wintwabottom set immediately, and that Yevgen should be carrying the guard snow, so they should be careful about that. Feng says he has understood everything and leaves the room, leaving his new master, who turns back to look out the window and begins to talk about his brother, Junker. He had a very disloyal butler, thinking he could betray his master who served without any remorse and threw him into the swamp. But thanks to Feng's magic, Vlado was able to escape from the lake that day, and whatever the case may be, Junker was dead, and now he had that castle. Moreover, his sister's vengeful spirit had not appeared in his dreams, but there was a different feeling in his heart. Every time the clock struck, The bell marking the hour made Vlado feel even more ill, and with those candles in front of him, he wondered if Junker also hated this world. That night, Boris, lying in his bed, thought that the instructor was quite eccentric, because if his servant hadn't woken him, he would probably still be sleeping in his bed. But soon, he began thinking about when the lessons would begin, as he wanted to learn everything he could to win Hana's fight, although it was just an agreement between him and the Count, with no need to win. But the protagonist wanted to do his best, as it would give him an advantage in surviving. And if he wanted to do it as Yevgen had said, he would need to use the Infernal, which was under his bed. Boris was horrified to see that his sword had disappeared. He started searching under the bed, but couldn't find anything. He was terrified to see that the Infernal was gone, so he began running frantically through the castle, not knowing how this could have happened, as that sword was only with him because of his brother's sacrifice. The servant appeared with a candle and asked his master what had happened. Boris apologized for being there in the middle of the night but needed help with something important. Ranzir said he was there to serve in whatever was needed. The protagonist then asked him to find Instructor Noguera. The servant said that before that, Boris couldn't go out dressed like that. Then he covered him with a cloak. Ranzir noticed that the protagonist was holding a sword and was confused about why he needed a weapon at this hour. Still, he started walking with his master to search for Amit. Upon reaching his room, they noticed that no one was there. The protagonist began searching the bed to see if the Infernal was there. The servant asked what he was looking for, as there was no place in the room that could be used as a hiding spot. Boris realized that Ranzir was right, and the Infernal was not there. It was very likely that the sword was with the instructor, so both left the room, and the protagonist kept wondering where Amit could have gone in the middle of the night. He asked his servant if someone wanted to leave the castle through the gate, they would have to pass through the guards. The boy replied that the guards only opened the gate in the middle of the night with the Count's permission, and that the north gate might be open, but there were also guards in the garden. Boris then asked if people could leave through this open gate. He went straight to that location, hoping to find the instructor. After walking for a while, the servant said they were close to the gate. Boris thought that if the worst-case scenario happened, he couldn't hesitate to act, because if he couldn't protect the last memory left by Yevgen and his father, he didn't deserve to carry the Geneman name. The protagonist started wondering if the swordsman had escaped, and if he couldn't catch him, what he would do. Ranzir stopped walking and called his master to see something. They were seeing the swordsman holding a sword with a glow as elegant as the moonlight and a fleeting meteor shower. Boris, seeing that, understood now that the winter sword wasn't made with good intentions. However, even so, he had to retrieve it. Amit, who was in a combat stance, said to the boys that he had finished watching them and that it was time to leave. The swordsman asked what they were doing at that time in the garden. Both were speechless until Boris said that the sword belonged to him and that the instructor had looked enough so he could return it. Amit told the protagonist that he had lost the sword, but Boris said that it had been stolen and he hadn't lost it. The swordsman asked the boy if he had the skill to take it back. Without an answer, he began to sheath the sword and hold it, staring at Boris, and said that he wasn't going to return it, but the protagonist said that he was going to get it back, no matter what happened. The instructor said he didn't want to steal and run away, and besides, he would never take the life of a child, but since the protagonist had said that, it was better to make a bet. Boris was surprised to hear that. Amit made the protagonist not have the impression that he was a trustworthy instructor, and it was something he did for himself, but he had promised the Count to teach swordsmanship until the next spring, and until then, he would give the protagonist the chance to take the Infernal every day. So if he succeeded, he would never lay hands on the weapon again. But if Boris failed, before leaving, he would do everything to make the sword his. After proposing the bet, he asked the protagonist what he thought. Holding a dagger, the protagonist admitted that his life was not just his own, and that his brother's life was on his shoulders, and that was why he had to continue surviving, as if he were an immortal who would live forever. And at the same time, as a Gineman, he had to protect the Infernal and not let it leave his hands. He then asked the swordsman what he would use to fulfill the promise. Amit said he would give that dagger as a token of the agreement, and if Boris won, he would have to return the dagger. The protagonist was surprised to see that weapon, especially when the instructor said that the dagger was important.
If you enjoyed this video, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell icon, and like the video. Thank you.